AT Sippers, I'm back. I'm back. Hey, Crystal. Let me get me something to drink right quick. I had to get it set back up. I was not going for that foolishness tonight. 200 and some people popped in here and wouldn't hit the like button. Nah. Come on back. I'm back. What time is it? Look, 9 minutes. I had to make me some sour sop tea. They tried to play in my face. I wasn't having it. Oh, it do taste like sour sap. I wish I had some money. Y'all come on in, hit the like button for me. Hey, Cynthia. That's good. Oh, that would be real good with some. Okay, so Lord, let me pick back up where I was leaving off. I'm gonna back that up where I really enjoyed President Obama's speech and ceremony. As you come in, hit the like button so we won't have no pauses and immediate shutdowns. I'm gonna pick up where I left off. I'm not gonna pause too long because the notification most definitely went out because I got it. Let me put this down. Sour sop tea is okay. That's all right. Hey, Samantha. I'm gonna pick up where I left off. I'm gonna change the background. I think he was talking. They did that, baby. Let me cut this backlight out. Y'all ready?
Call, click, or stop by. Granger, for the ones getting done.
Y'all ready? Hold on.
Something that happened in Chicago that most people are going to remember for the wrong reasons. On June the 18th, 2026, Barack Obama opened his presidential center on the south side of Chicago. $850 million,
850.
nearly 20 acres, a museum tower that rises 225 feet into the skyline. And what Barack did on that stage, standing in front of thousands of people with the nation watching, was not just cut a ribbon. He made a choice, a deliberate, careful, unmistakable choice to
Precise.
talk about the future of American democracy at a moment when the very idea of democracy is under more pressure than most of us have seen in our lifetimes. Now, I was there. Hillary and I were there. George W. Bush was there. Joe Biden was there. 3 former presidents sitting together on a stage in the June heat. And I want you to hold on to that picture for a moment, because who was not on that stage tells you just as much as who was. And we'll come back to what that absence really means in a moment. But first, I want you to understand something. What Barack Obama said in that speech was not an accident. Every word was chosen. Every silence was intentional. And if you only saw the headlines, if you only caught the clips, you missed the most important part of what actually happened in Chicago. Because this was not just about a building. This was about whether the things we say we believe in as Americans still mean anything at all. Let me tell you what it felt like standing there. You had Bruce Springsteen, you had Stevie Wonder, you had Jennifer Hudson and Common and the Roots closing the whole thing out with Higher Ground. It was a celebration, absolutely. But underneath the music and the applause, there was something heavier in the air, something everybody could feel, but nobody wanted to name out loud. See, when George W. Bush opened his presidential library back in 2013, he invited Barack Obama. That's what you do. That's the tradition. Republican, Democrat, it doesn't matter. You invite the sitting president because the institution is bigger than any one person's politics. That's how it's always worked. But Barack made the decision not to invite President Trump to this opening. Now, I want to be honest with you about that because it's complicated. And I say that as somebody who was sitting right there. The south side of Chicago, Juneteenth weekend, an $850 million center built in Jackson Park, a historically black neighborhood designed to be a gathering place for the community. The timing was deliberate. The location was deliberate. And the guest list was deliberate too. This was not an oversight. This was a statement. And whether you agree with that statement or not, you've got to understand what led to it. Because context matters. It always matters. Here's the honest truth about what Barack said from that stage. He never mentioned Donald Trump by name. Not once.
Gave him no power.
But every single person listening knew exactly who he was talking about. He stood up there and he laid out what he called the shared values that make democracy possible. He talked about checks and balances. He talked about an independent judiciary and a free press. He talked about the military and law enforcement owing their allegiance not to any president or political party, but to the people and to the Constitution. He said, no one is above the law or beneath its protection. He talked about the peaceful transfer of power after fair and free elections. Now you tell me, why does a former president feel the need to stand up and remind the country of things that used to be so obvious nobody had to say them out loud? And this is where things start to get complicated, because just days before that ceremony, Barack sat down with Robin Roberts on Good Morning America, and he said something that lit a fuse. He said he was doubtful that any deal President Trump makes with Iran would be significantly different or a significant improvement from the deal his own administration put in place back in 2015. The deal Trump pulled out of in 2018, the deal Trump called the worst deal ever. And then at the G7, the response was not a policy rebuttal, it was personal, and it was ugly. And that backdrop made everything Barack said on that stage in Chicago land 10 times harder. Now let me be straight with you about the decision not to invite the sitting president, because I've been thinking about this a lot. I understand why Barack made that call. I do. President Trump posted an AI-generated image on social media showing the Obama Presidential Center as a giant garbage can with a trash bag on top and homeless encampments all around it. He called it a mecca for people who hate America. At the G7 summit, he used language about Barack that I'm not even going to repeat on this program because it doesn't deserve to be repeated. So I get it. When someone has spent years personally degrading you, degrading your legacy, degrading the very idea of what you built, there's a human limit. But here's where I have to be honest, as someone who has been in that office. When you break the tradition of inviting the sitting president to a presidential center opening, you are setting a precedent. And precedents have consequences that outlast the feelings that created them. I worked with people who opposed everything I stood for. I sat across from Newt Gingrich during a government shutdown, and we still found ways to talk. Not because I liked it, because the country needed it. And I genuinely worry that when we start deciding which norms to keep and which ones to throw away based on how badly the other side has behaved, we end up losing the very architecture that holds the whole thing together. Barack's speech defended institutions, but the guest list challenged one. And I think we have to be willing to hold both of those truths at the same time. Let me tell you something about the presidency that people don't think about enough. The office is bigger than the person who holds it. It's bigger than their personality, bigger than their policies, bigger than their Twitter feed or their Truth Social account. When I left office, I understood something that took me 8 years to fully learn. The presidency doesn't belong to you. You're borrowing it. You're a tenant, not an owner. And every president before you and every president after you is part of the same chain. When that chain breaks, when former presidents stop sharing stages with sitting presidents, when presidential centers become battlefields instead of meeting grounds, when a sitting president uses artificial intelligence to create images mocking his predecessor's legacy and post them for millions of people to see, something is happening to the institution itself that goes way beyond politics. Barack stood up there and warned about cynicism and despair. He talked about institutions falling victim to the idea that everything is about money, everything is about attention, everything is about fame. And he's right about that. But what I want people to understand is that the erosion doesn't happen all at once. It happens one broken norm at a time, one insult at a time, one AI-generated image at a time, one decision not to extend an invitation at a time, until one day you look around and the traditions that used to hold the country together are just gone. And nobody can remember exactly when they disappeared. Now I want to talk about why Barack chose this particular moment to say what he said. Because timing in politics is never an accident. This speech landed right in the middle of the G7 summit. It landed while the Iran deal was blowing up in the news. It landed while the president was overseas, calling Barack names I wouldn't use about my worst enemy. And it landed at the beginning of a midterm election cycle. Barack Obama is the most unifying figure the Democratic Party has. He knows that. Everybody knows that. And he made a strategic decision
Called him
to
a stupid
re-enter
son
the
of a
political conversation, not through a cable news interview, not through
He
a
called him a stupid son of a itch. Y'all see that? Hit the like button, y'all. It's 172 people in here, only 8 likes. What are we doing? Double tap the face of your phone if that's how you're listening. And if you're on your computer, hit those 3 dots at the top right corner. He called him a stupid. I mean, we know he is far beyond stupid. He's brilliant.
want people to understand is that the erosion doesn't happen all at once. It happens one broken norm at a time, one insult at a time, one AI-generated image at a time.
Wow.
We end up losing the very architecture that holds the whole thing together. Barack's speech defended institutions, but the guest list challenged one. And I think we have to be willing to hold both of those truths at the same time. Let me tell you something about the presidency that people don't think about enough. The office is bigger than the person who holds it. It's bigger than their personality, bigger than their policies, bigger than their Twitter feed or their Truth Social account. When I left office, I understood something that took me 8 years to fully learn. The presidency doesn't belong to you. You're borrowing it. You're a tenant, not an owner. And every president before you and every president after you is part of the same chain. When that chain breaks, when former presidents stop sharing stages with sitting presidents, when presidential centers become battlefields instead of meeting grounds, when a sitting president uses artificial intelligence to create images mocking his predecessor's legacy and posts them for millions of people to see, something is happening to the institution itself that goes way beyond politics.
Jealousy.
Barack stood up there and warned about cynicism and despair. He talked about institutions falling victim to the idea that everything is about money, everything is about attention, everything is about fame. And he's right about that. But what I want people to understand is that the erosion doesn't happen all at once. It happens one broken norm at a time, one insult at a time, one AI-generated image at a time, one decision not to extend an invitation at a time, until one day you look around and the traditions that used to hold the country together are just gone. And nobody can remember exactly when they disappeared. Now I want to talk about why Barack chose this particular moment to say what he said. Because timing in politics is never an accident. This speech landed right in the middle of the G7 summit. It landed while the Iran deal was blowing up in the news. It landed while the president was overseas, calling Barack names I wouldn't use about my worst enemy. And it landed at the beginning of a midterm election cycle. Barack Obama is the most unifying figure the Democratic Party has.
How much?
He knows that. Everybody knows that. And he made a strategic decision to re-enter the political conversation, not through a cable news interview, not through a rally, not through a fundraiser, but through a presidential center dedication. And here's why that's smart. A presidential center carries weight. It carries permanence. When you speak from behind a podium at your own center, with your words literally carved into the stone of the building, you're not just giving a speech, you're placing your argument inside the architecture of American history. You're saying, this is what I stood for, and I'm going to let history judge whether I was right. That's a different kind of authority than a tweet or a soundbite. Whether Democrats can translate that moral authority into votes in November is a separate question entirely. But Barack gave them the language. He gave them the framework. The question now is whether anyone picks it up and runs with it. Here's what I think happens next. And I want you to pay close attention because this part matters more than anything else I've said. The temperature is going to keep rising. After the G7 comments, after the name calling, after the Iran deal back and forth, we are in an escalation cycle. And escalation cycles have a logic of their own. They don't stop because somebody decides to be reasonable. They stop when something forces them to stop. The media is going to frame this whole thing as Obama versus Trump, round two, the rematch nobody asked for. And that framing is going to bury the substance of what Barack actually said. The part about checks and balances, about free press, about peaceful transfer of power, about no one being above the law. That's the part that matters. That's the part that will still matter in 50 years. But it's going to get lost in the noise. Meanwhile, the Iran situation is going to test everybody's credibility. Barack said any new deal would be doubtfully different from the JCPOA. Trump says his deal is better and stronger. We're going to find out who's right. And depending on how that memorandum of understanding plays out, one of them is going to look prophetic, and the other is going to have a lot of explaining to do. The stakes on that question are not political. They are life and death for people in the Middle East. And I hope both sides remember that before they turn foreign policy into another scoreboard. Let me leave you with this. I've been doing this a long time. I've seen this country go through things that people said we'd never survive. I was president during a government shutdown that lasted weeks. I was impeached by the House of Representatives. I watched the country tear itself apart over partisan investigations and personal attacks. And I sat in that Oval Office and I kept working because that's what the job demands. America has survived deep divisions before. We survived a civil war. We survived Watergate. We survived the 60s and the 70s and every moment when it felt like the center could not hold. And the reason we survived is not because our leaders were always great. It's because enough ordinary people refused to give up on the idea that this experiment in self-governance was worth fighting for. That's what Barack was really saying in Chicago. Not that one party is right and the other is wrong, but that the system itself, the system of laws and norms and institutions and shared values, that system is worth protecting. And he's right about that. Where I might add my own emphasis is this: protecting the system doesn't just mean defending it in speeches. It means doing the hard, unglamorous, frustrating work of reaching across the aisle, of listening to people you disagree with, of choosing progress over purity. The system only works if citizens demand better. Not better from one side, better from everybody. So I'm asking you to do what Barack asked you to do. Don't give in to cynicism. Don't give in to despair. Vote. Show up. Pay attention. Because the only people who lose when democracy weakens are the people who needed it most in the first place. And that, my friends, is all of us.
That should be some game over.
You know, folks, most people scrolled right past what happened on June the 9th in Maine. And I understand that. Life is busy, the news moves fast, and a Democratic Senate primary in a small New England state doesn't exactly stop you in your tracks. But let me tell you something, it should have. Because when Graham Plattner, a 41-year-old Marine veteran and oyster farmer from Sullivan, Maine, won that Democratic Senate nomination, the entire 2026 midterm battleground map shifted underneath our feet. Now here's why that matters to every single one of you, whether you live in Maine or Montana or anywhere in between.
I missed this one.
Democrats need to flip 4 seats to take back the Senate majority. 4 seats. And Maine was supposed to be the surest bet on the board. Susan Collins is the only Republican senator representing a state that Kamala Harris carried in 2024. Harris won Maine by 7 points. This should be the easiest pickup Democrats have. But the candidate they just nominated to carry that fight is walking into a general election with more personal baggage than I've seen on a first-time candidate in a very long time. And whether that baggage ends up costing Democrats their shot at the Senate majority, well, we'll come back to that in a moment. Because first you need to understand the bigger picture of what's really happening in American politics right now and just how close this whole thing actually is. Now look, let me set the stage for you, because this isn't just about one race in one state. The United States Senate sits at 53 Republicans, 47 Democrats. That's the reality after the 2024 cycle handed the GOP 4 new seats and a comfortable majority. But here's where it gets interesting. Donald Trump's approval ratings have fallen to record lows. His war in Iran is deeply unpopular with the American people. The economy still feels broken for working families. And because of all that, Democrats have been able to recruit some of the strongest Senate candidates I've seen in years. Roy Cooper, a 2-term former governor is running in North Carolina for the open seat left by Tom Tillis's retirement. Sabato's crystal ball just moved that race to lean Democrat. In Ohio, Sherrod Brown, the only Democrat
And
to win
Envy.
statewide there in nearly 20 years, is running a special election against John Husted for the seat J.D. Vance gave up to become vice president. That race just moved to toss-up. And in Alaska, Mary Peltola, who beat Sarah Palin for a House seat in 2022, is challenging Dan Sullivan, and the early polling has her competitive. Chuck Schumer is out there saying Democrats have a clear and strong path to the majority. And this is where things start to get complicated. Because all of those paths, every single one of them, assumed that Maine was going to be the foundation, the first domino, the one race Democrats could count on. So let me walk you through what happened in Maine, because the facts matter here. Graham Plattner launched his campaign in August of 2025. Within 10 days, he'd raised $1 million and signed up 3,000 volunteers. He drew 6,500 people to a rally in Portland with Bernie Sanders. He was endorsed by Sanders, by Elizabeth Warren, by Ruben Gallego. He ran as a populist outsider, taking on the billionaire class, fighting for working Mainers who can't afford rent or groceries or health care. And the voters responded. Governor Janet Mills, who had the backing of Schumer and the entire Democratic establishment, couldn't keep up. She dropped out in April. On June the 9th, Plattner won the primary with 72% of the vote. Now that's an extraordinary political story. A first-time candidate, an oyster farmer, defeating the sitting governor and the full weight of the party machine. But here's the honest truth that nobody in politics wants to say out loud right now. Graham Plattner is also carrying controversies that would have ended most campaigns before they started. There were Reddit posts from years back, offensive comments, one mocking a wounded Purple Heart veteran. There was a skull and crossbones tattoo on his chest that resembled a Nazi symbol. He says he didn't know the history when he got it with fellow Marines, and he's had it covered up. And then, just days before the primary, reports surfaced that he'd exchanged sexually explicit text messages with multiple women while married. Now, I am the last person on this earth who is going to throw stones at someone over personal mistakes. I know what it's like to have your worst moments become the only thing people talk about. But I also know this. In a general election against a 5-term incumbent with a $30 million war chest, these are not just personal matters anymore. They become strategic vulnerabilities with national consequences. And we've got to...
Can I get y'all to hit the like button? 35 minutes in, 283 people are in listening to this sound conversation, but I only have 27 likes. Do the math. How is that? 294 people in here, only 27 likes, 35 minutes in. What are we doing, y'all? I need for y'all to hit those 3 dots at the top right corner of your device and hit the like button. I mean, like right now, it's too late. It's 1:13 in the morning. When I stop, y'all gonna think I'm doing, hit the double tap the face of your phone. If you're listening in on your phone device, I gotta start raising my voice like I'm your mama. Y'all, you can't be nice. You gotta start talking to folk crazy. You know, like you tell your kids to pick up your clothes and they sit there and continue playing the game like they didn't hear you. Can you hear me now? Get my likes up or I will stop this. I did it 30, 40 minutes ago. Stopped them right midstream. It's too late for this. I got bath water waiting for me. I thought y'all was grown folks up in here. I guess not. 171 people in here. Only 40 likes. Double tap the face of your phone. I'm watching it. I'm looking at it. I'm paying attention. Please don't make me stop again. It's too late for that. Continue to hit the like button. And if I have to stop again, I'm out of here.
with multiple women while married. Now, I am the last person on this earth who is going to throw stones at someone over personal mistakes. I know what it's like to have your worst moments become the only thing people talk about. But I also know this. In a general election against a 5-term incumbent with a $30 million war chest, these are not just personal matters anymore. They become strategic vulnerabilities with national consequences. And we've got to be honest about that. And that brings me to something that's been bothering me about how this whole situation was handled from the top. We've got to remember that leadership in a political party isn't just about picking winners. It's about building a team that can actually govern. And what happened in Maine tells me there were leadership failures at multiple levels. First, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee and Senator Schumer recruited Janet Mills. Now, I have great respect for Governor Mills. She's a serious public servant. But she was 78 years old, running in a cycle that was screaming for energy and generational change. The voters told us plainly they wanted something different, and the establishment wasn't listening. Second, when the controversies around
When y'all get the likes up, I started back. Y'all thought I was playing. No, because ain't nobody hit the like button. So I'm waiting for them to leave. Can y'all leave if y'all can't hit the like button? Can you get your ass up out of here? Y'all finna have to talk to you ignorant. Get your ass up out of here if you can't hit the like button. Can you leave? Can you hear the words that are coming out of my mouth? Get your ass up out of here. Go somewhere else. We don't want to partake with you. We don't like your kind. You can't hit the like button. You slow. You can't understand. Somebody got to talk to you ignorant for you to hit the like button. And I don't feel like it. Yeah, get on out. Hit the door. Yeah, take your like back too. I don't give a shit. But you get your ass up out of here. Yeah. I had to talk to you like your mama should have. Yeah, your mama didn't teach you manners. Coming up in folk place and you don't hit the like button. Get your monkey ass up out of here. Hi, Mel. You didn't hit the like button. You leave too. Mel Northern, my like didn't go up when you came in. So if you can't hit the like button, I want you to get your ass up out of here too. Let me put you out. Next time you bring your ass up in here, you hit the like button. Bye. As I see y'all asses enter in and my likes don't go off, I'm gonna put you out. How about that? Let me put some jazz on. I know how to get your ass up out of here. Y'all just don't want to leave. What you here for? You can't hit the like button. You don't want to leave. What in the world is going on? What type of frackanacka book is this? Go get your tea somewhere else, baby. Go sip on somebody else's tea. Yeah, get your ass up out of here. Some more people need to leave. I hope you don't like what I'm saying so you can get your ass up out of here. Don't come back. Don't leave and try to come back. Hit my like button. I ain't finna play with y'all. It's too late. It's too late. It's Friday morning. Early Friday morning. Oh yeah. You better get your ass out of here. Or hit the like button. Them the only choices you have. Hit my like button or get your ass up. Yeah, keep dropping. That's what I want. That's right there. Right there, right there, right there. Leave. She mean. She this. You say whatever you want to. You ain't hit my like button. What you get is what you get. Stop coming back. Auntie Fee. I am not playing. You don't have no home training. Your mama or your daddy didn't teach y'all asses right. Follow up in people's houses. Don't follow the rules. Don't do nothing. Shit, you a lie. Hit the like button. Hit those 3 dots at the top right corner. I'ma hunt you all night. I'ma be in your sleep.
Shatner is also carrying controversies that would have ended most campaigns before they started. There were Reddit posts from years back of Sanders by Elizabeth Warren, by Ruben Gallego. He ran as a populist outsider taking on the billionaire class, fighting for working Mainers who can't afford rent or groceries or health care. And the voters responded. Governor Janet Mills, who had the backing of Schumer and the entire Democratic establishment, couldn't keep up. She dropped out in April. On June the 9th, Plattner won the primary with 72% of the vote. Now that's an extraordinary political story. A first-time candidate, an oyster farmer,
Hey,
defeating
Joe.
the sitting governor and the full weight of the party machine. But here's the honest truth that nobody in politics wants to say out loud right now. Graham Plattner is also carrying controversies that would have ended most campaigns before they started. There were Reddit posts from years back, offensive comments, one mocking a wounded Purple Heart veteran. There was a skull and crossbones tattoo on his chest that resembled a Nazi symbol. He says he didn't know the history when he got it with fellow Marines, and he's had it covered up. And then, just days before the primary, reports surfaced that he'd exchanged sexually explicit text messages with multiple women while married. Now, I am the last person on this earth who is going to throw stones at someone over personal mistakes. I know what it's like to have your worst moments become the only thing people talk about. But I also know this. In a general election against a 5-term incumbent with a $30 million war chest, these are not just personal matters anymore. They become strategic vulnerabilities with national consequences. And we've got to be honest about that. And that brings me to something that's been bothering me about how this whole situation was handled from the top. We've got to remember that leadership in a political party isn't just about picking winners. It's about building a team that can actually govern. And what happened in Maine tells me there were leadership failures at multiple levels. First, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee and Senator Schumer recruited Janet Mills. Now, I have great respect for Governor Mills. She's a serious public servant. But she was 78 years old, running in a cycle that was screaming for energy and generational change. The voters told us plainly they wanted something different, and the establishment wasn't listening. Second, when the controversies around Plattner started surfacing, the Reddit posts, the tattoo, nobody in a position of authority pumped the brakes. Bernie Sanders said we should focus on working families, not Plattner's personal life. I understand that instinct. But there's a difference between defending a candidate and refusing to acknowledge real risks. And
$AUNTEAFEE.
third, Plattner himself. On the night he won the primary, he called Susan Collins spineless and corrupt. He said she lied about protecting abortion rights. Now, I understand the frustration behind those words, but let me tell you from experience, the independent voters in Maine, the ones who actually decide general elections, they don't respond well to that kind of language. They want someone who can fight hard and still treat people with basic respect. There's a difference between conviction and recklessness. And right now, I'm not sure the people advising this young man understand which side of that line they're on. Now let me step back and tell you what this really reveals about where the Democratic Party is right now, because it goes way beyond Maine. What we just watched was the party establishment put forward their preferred candidate, a seasoned governor with decades of experience. and the grassroots blew right through her. That's happened before. It happened with Bernie and Hillary in 2016. It happened in various House primaries. And every time it happens, we have to ask ourselves the same uncomfortable question. Has this party learned anything about the difference between winning a primary and winning a general election? Because those are two fundamentally different things. In a primary, passion wins, energy wins. The loudest voice in the room gets the most applause. But a general election in a swing state requires persuasion. It requires reaching people who don't already agree with you. It requires a candidate who can walk into a VFW hall in Bangor and a union hall in Lewiston and a living room in suburban Portland and make every single person in that room feel heard. Now, there's been some quiet talk about the main ballot replacement provision, that if Plattner were to step aside before July the 13th, the state party could select a new nominee at a convention. Let me tell you something. That is not going to would alienate every single voter who showed up on June the 9th and chose Plattner with their own party learned anything. Uncomfortable question. Happened with Bernie and Hillary in 2016. It happened in various House primaries. And every time it happens, we have to ask ourselves the same uncomfortable question. Has this party learned anything about the difference between winning a primary and winning a general election? Because those are two fundamentally different things. In a primary, passion wins, energy wins. The loudest voice in the room gets the most applause. But a general election in a swing state requires persuasion. It requires reaching people who don't already agree with you. It requires a candidate who can walk into a VFW hall in Bangor and a union hall in Lewiston and a living room in suburban Portland and make every single person in that room feel heard. Now, there's been some quiet talk about the main ballot replacement provision, that if Plattner were to step aside before July the 13th, the state party could select a new nominee at a convention. Let me tell you something. That is not going to happen. And even if it did, it would alienate every single voter who showed up on June the 9th and chose Plattner with their own hands. You cannot tell 72% of your primary voters that their choice doesn't count and expect them to show up for you in November. And here's why the stakes in Maine ripple far beyond Maine's borders. Let me walk you through the math, because this is the part most people don't fully appreciate. Democrats need 4 seats. Their clearest path right now runs through North Carolina, where Roy Cooper is ahead. It runs through Maine, where they need Plattner to beat Collins. It runs through Ohio, where Sherrod Brown has a puncher's chance in the special election. And then they need a 4th, and that 4th is most likely Alaska, where Mary Peltola is running in a state Trump carried by 13 points. That is an extraordinarily narrow path. Now, if Maine is a toss-up instead of a likely Democratic pickup, the entire calculation changes. Suddenly, the DSC has to pour money into a race they thought was secure. That's money that doesn't go to Ohio. That's money that doesn't go to Alaska. One weakened candidate in one state forces Democrats to stretch resources across the entire map. And when you're trying to thread a needle through 4 states simultaneously, you cannot afford a single one of them to wobble. I've seen this before, folks. I've watched election cycles where one miscalculation in one primary created a chain reaction that cost the party winnable seats in states 1,000 miles away. Georgia, with John Ossoff defending, is still competitive. Michigan has a messy Democratic primary that won't resolve until August. Every piece of this puzzle has to fall exactly right for Democrats to get to 50. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 roads that could unfold from here. And I want to be straight with you about all of them. The first road is that Graham Plattner cleans up his act, runs a disciplined general election campaign focused on kitchen table issues, housing costs, health care, groceries, the things Maine families actually lose sleep over, and makes this race a referendum on Susan Collins' record, not his own past. If he does that, he can win. Collins' approval in Maine has dropped below 43%. Mainers are frustrated. The environment favors Democrats. But discipline is the key word. And nothing I've seen so far tells me discipline is this campaign's strong suit. The second road is that the controversies keep coming. Republicans have barely started their opposition research. The National Republican Senatorial Committee has already promised to expose and destroy his candidacy. If more stories surface, if the sexting allegations expand, if the Reddit posts get turned into television ads that run every 15 minutes from Labor Day to November, Collins wins, and Democrats almost certainly fall short of the majority. The third road, the one some nervous insiders whisper about, is that Plattner steps aside voluntarily before the July deadline. I'll be honest, I don't think that happens. His voters would feel betrayed, and the replacement process would be chaotic at best. But I want you to understand that the fact serious people are even discussing it tells you everything you need to know about how fragile this moment is. But here's what I want to leave you with, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart. What happened in Maine on June the 9th was democracy in action. The voters spoke. They chose the candidate who excited them, who made them feel heard, who promised to fight the billionaire class and stand up for working people. That is democracy working exactly the way it's supposed to. And I will never criticize the American people for making their choice. But democracy also asks us to be honest with ourselves about what comes next. Excitement wins primaries. Discipline wins general elections. And the distance between those two things is where campaigns go to live or die. I learned that lesson the hard way across 2 presidential campaigns and 8 years in the White House. You have to earn every single vote, not just the ones that already love you, but the ones that aren't sure about you yet, the ones that are watching and waiting and deciding whether you're serious enough to trust with their future. Democrats have a real path to taking back the Senate in 2026. It is narrow, it is fragile, and it demands that every single candidate on this map, in Maine, in North Carolina, in Ohio, in Alaska, in Georgia, runs like their race is the one that decides everything, because it might be. The American people deserve a Senate that works for them.
Right.
They deserve leaders who show up not just with passion, but with the preparation and the character to govern once they get there. That's what I believe. That's what I've always believed. And I still believe this country has the capacity to get it right, but only if we're willing to do the hard, honest work that democracy demands of all of us.
Media day for the Obama president.
Hold on. Oh, I'm out of juice. Hold on. Y'all hit the like button. Get the likes up or get out. Get the likes up or get out. You choose. Double tap those three dots. Hit those three dots at the top right corner.
Because what happened in the last 24 hours
This was a few
between
days
the United
ago.
States and Iran is something every...
This was a few days ago.
Folks, I want you to sit with me for a minute on this one. Because what happened in the last 24 hours between the United States and Iran is something every American needs to understand. On Thursday, June the 11th, President Trump stood in the Oval Office and told the world he had just reached what he called a great settlement with Iran. He said the deal had been approved at the highest levels. He said the Supreme Leader had signed off. He even canceled military strikes that were already planned and said Vice President J.D. Vance could fly out for a signing ceremony as soon as this weekend. Now that alone would be a historic moment. But here is what happened next, and this is where you really need to pay attention. Within hours, Iranian state media, IRNA, and the Mehr news agency published what they said were the actual leaked deal terms of the Trump-Iran deal. And folks, what Iran described looked nothing like what the White House was selling. Trump went on Truth Social the very next morning, calling it all fake news and calling the Iranians dishonorable people. Now look, when two sides walk out of the same room and tell completely different stories about what just happened, that is not a disagreement over details. That is a credibility crisis. And we'll come back to why that matters in a moment. Because the specifics of what each side is claiming will tell you everything you need to know. Let me give you a little context here, because none of this happened overnight. This goes back to February 28th of this year, when the United States and Israel launched strikes against Iran. That started a war that has consumed the Middle East for months. The Strait of Hormuz got shut down, oil markets went haywire, the entire global economy felt it. President Trump sent a 15-point proposal to Tehran through Pakistan back in March. Iran came back with its own 10-point plan through Islamabad. And let me tell you, those two documents were miles apart. Iran wanted continued control of the Strait of Hormuz. They wanted every sanction lifted. They wanted their nuclear enrichment program left alone. The United States wanted full dismantlement. So for months, you had indirect negotiations going back and forth. A ceasefire pause in April, and then suddenly on June 11th, Trump announces from the Oval Office that it is done. The Supreme Leader approved it. A memorandum of understanding is ready. Now, I have been in rooms where agreements get made. I know what a finished deal looks like. And I also know the difference between announcing a deal and actually one.
I let it run out of juice. I'm sorry, my bad. My bad. Yeah, this time it's my fault. I didn't plug it up when I saw that it was running low on juice. Is this the one? Okay, yeah.
Trump announces from the Oval Office that it is done. The Supreme Leader approved it. A memorandum of understanding is ready. Now, I have been in rooms where agreements get made. I know what a finished deal looks like. And I also know the difference between announcing a deal and actually having one. That difference, my friends, is everything. So let us walk through what each side is actually claiming, because this is where it gets truly extraordinary. According to Iranian state media, the deal, which they described in 14 points, includes $300 billion release of $24 billion in frozen assets. It says there are no new commitments on Iran's nuclear program, that nuclear negotiations would not even begin until 60 days after the memorandum is signed. It said Iran would not transfer management of the Strait of Hormuz to anyone. And it includes a commitment from the United States to compel Israel to stop fighting in Lebanon. Now listen to the other side. A senior Trump administration official told reporters the deal was a performance-based deal built on 5 points. Iran dismantles its entire nuclear program, destroys all nuclear materials, reopens the strait, stops funding terrorist proxies, and gets no money until it performs. Folks, I have negotiated a few agreements in my time, and I will tell you something straight. You cannot have two parties describing a completely different document and call that an agreement. One of these versions is wrong, or maybe both of them are aspirational, but neither one is a done deal. And this is where I want to talk about the decision making, because it matters. When you are the President of the United States and you stand in the Oval Office and tell the American people and the entire world that a deal has been approved by all parties involved, you had better be right. That announcement becomes a fact on the ground. Markets move, allies recalibrate, military postures shift. And what happened here is that Trump declared victory before the ink was dry, before there was any ink at all. He said the Supreme Leader had signed off. Iran never confirmed that. He canceled strikes that were his primary source of leverage. Now look, I understand the desire to show progress.
Hey, smoke to the bone
I
barbecue.
understand the pressure to deliver a big win. When I
Dang,
was
I
working on the
remember
Middle East
you,
peace process,
your chop baked potato. You used to be at sometimes years ago at that Shell in Duncanville, in Dallas, where the well, you remember that? Yep.
there were moments when I wanted
That's
to go
when I
out
used to eat
and
meat.
tell the world we were close, but I had learned the hard way. You hold that announcement until the very last possible second, because the announcement itself is leverage.
I'm sorry,
Once
let
you
me go
say
back.
you
I
have a
started
deal
thinking about
of
your baked
leverage,
potato. Forgot where I was
any
at.
ink at all. He said the Supreme Leader had signed off. Iran never confirmed that. He canceled strikes that were his primary source of leverage. Now look, I understand the desire to show progress. I understand the pressure to deliver a big win. When I was working on the Middle East peace process, there were moments when I wanted to go out and tell the world we were close, but I had learned the hard way. You hold that announcement until the very last possible second, because the announcement itself is leverage. Once you say you have a deal, you lose the ability to walk away credibly. And when J.D. Vance is being sent to sign something that the other side is publicly contradicting, that is not strength. That is exposure. Now here is what really concerns me. And I say this not as a Democrat, but as someone who sat in that office and represented this country. When a president announces a deal and the other party contradicts the terms within hours, every government on earth takes notice.
Okay.
Not just Iran. China is watching. Russia is watching. North Korea is watching. Every ally we have in Europe and Asia is asking the same question. Can we trust what Washington says it agreed to? Because the foundation of American diplomacy is that our word means something. That when we put terms on paper, those terms are real. Now think about this. When we negotiated the original Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, back in 2015 under President Obama, you had the P5+1 nations at the table. You had the International Atomic Energy Agency building a verification framework. You had years of technical negotiations with inspectors and scientists and legal experts, making sure every provision was enforceable. Whatever you thought of that deal politically, there was a process. There was institutional weight behind it. What I am looking at right now is two press releases from two different governments describing two different realities, and a social media post calling the other side dishonorable. That is not diplomacy. That is chaos. Let me tell you something about the political dynamics here, because they matter too. President Trump needed this. He needed a dramatic foreign policy victory. The announcement was built for that. The Oval Office setting, the language of a great settlement, the promise of a signing ceremony. But Iran may have understood that better than anyone, because what Tehran did by leaking those terms through IRNA was not careless. It may have been entirely strategic. They put out a version of the deal that makes it look like America gave away the store. $300 billion, frozen assets released immediately, no nuclear concessions. Hormuz stays under Iranian control. And the effect was immediate. Even Trump's own allies went after it. People called it total capitulation. So now Trump is trapped. If he walks away, he looks like he never had a deal at all. If he signs something close to Iran's version, his own party revolts. If he insists on his 5-point version, Iran will not perform. Pakistan's Prime Minister Sharif says a final text has been reached, but when both parties are publicly fighting over what that text says, the word final does not mean what it used to mean. This is what happens when you build foreign policy around spectacle instead of substance. So where does this go from here? Let me give you my honest assessment. There are really three paths. The first, and probably the most likely in the short term, is that some version of a memorandum of understanding gets signed this weekend with language vague enough that both sides can claim victory. Trump can say Iran agreed to dismantle its nuclear program. Iran can say the details will be negotiated over 60 days. The Strait of Hormuz reopens and oil markets calm down. Everyone takes a breath. But that kind of deal is inherently unstable because the core contradictions have not been resolved. The second path is that the whole thing collapses. The contradictions become too public, the trust deficit is too deep, strikes resume, and we are back to escalation with fewer options than before. The third path, and the one I would hope for, is that serious, quiet, multilateral negotiations begin during that 60-day window with IAEA inspectors, with congressional oversight, with real verification mechanisms that do not depend on either side's press releases. What I want to see as a Democrat and as an American is a process that includes inspections, transparency, enforceable commitments, and partners who can hold both sides accountable. Because a deal that only exists in a Truth Social post is not a deal at all. And so let me close with this. I am not here to score political points. I never found that particularly useful, and I do not think you do either. But I am here to tell you that what we are watching right now matters. Not just for the Middle East, not just for oil prices, not just for the next election. It matters for whether the United States of America can still be trusted to mean what it says. It matters for whether our diplomatic process is serious or performative. It matters for whether agreements between nations are built on documents or declarations, on verification or faith, on institutions or impulse. Now look, I have seen this country correct course before. I have seen us make mistakes and come back stronger. I have seen administrations of both parties learn hard lessons and build something better out of them. But that only happens when the American people pay attention, when they ask the hard questions, when they demand that the people making deals on their behalf are held to the same standard of honesty and accountability that ordinary Americans are held to every single day. We deserve a foreign policy built on truth, built on process, and built on the understanding that America's credibility is not a bargaining chip. It is the whole foundation. And if we protect that, I still believe there is nothing this country cannot achieve.
Okay, I think I got one more put to the side before I crash out. Before I crash out tonight. Let me see. I think it was that one, but I'm not sure. Yeah, it's this one.
Sitting at a dinner table next to Emmanuel Macron.
Did I
You know,
play
folks,
this
I
one
want you to
earlier?
picture something with me for a moment. It's the evening of June 17th, 2026. The Palace of Versailles. The same palace where world leaders gathered in 1919 to redraw the map of the modern world after the most devastating war humanity had ever seen. And there, sitting at a dinner table next to Emmanuel Macron, surrounded by gold leaf and chandeliers and centuries of history, President Trump pulls out a pen and signs a memorandum of understanding with the Islamic Republic of Iran. He walks out afterward, reporters shouting questions, and he says, and I quote, "It's signed in Versailles, just signed it." Now look, I've signed my share of documents in grand settings. I understand the power of a moment. But here's what most people watching that video don't realize. It's not just what he signed, it's what he signed away.
Oh, Lord.
And more importantly, it's the road that brought us to that table in the first place. Because when you understand the full picture, what this deal actually says, what it doesn't say, what it cost us to get here, and where it leaves America going forward, you start to see something very different from the victory lap that's being presented. And I want to walk you through that tonight, honestly and carefully, because this matters. This isn't about one party or the other. This is about whether the United States of America is stronger or weaker tonight than it was before this whole thing started. And we'll come back to that question in a moment, because the answer might not be what you expect. Now, to understand what happened at Versailles, you've got to understand how we got there. And the story doesn't start in February of 2026 when the bombs started falling. It starts in 2018. That's when President Trump, during his first term, pulled the United States out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal that was negotiated under President Obama. Now, was that deal perfect? No. I'll be the first to tell you, no diplomatic agreement ever is. But here's what it did. It put real constraints on Iran's nuclear program. It had international inspectors on the ground. It had verification mechanisms. And it had the buy-in of our European allies, Russia and China. It was the kind of painstaking multilateral diplomacy that takes years to build. And it was torn up with a signature. Then came 8 years of maximum pressure. Sanctions piled on sanctions. And what happened? Iran didn't collapse. Iran accelerated its enrichment. Iran got closer to a weapon, not further away. Then on February 28th of this year, the United States and Israel launched massive joint strikes against Iranian military and government targets. Iran retaliated with the largest ballistic missile barrage in its history. Over 500 missiles hitting bases and facilities across 7 countries. The Strait of Hormuz was closed. Oil went from $75 a barrel to over $130 in 48 hours. The global economy was thrown into chaos. Let me tell you something I learned in my years in the White House. You can't evaluate a deal without understanding what you burned down to get to the negotiating table. And what we burned down to get to Versailles is something every American needs to reckon with. So let's talk about what's actually in this 14-point memorandum, because the details matter more than the photo opportunity. Point 1 declares the immediate and permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, including in Lebanon, where Israel has been fighting Hezbollah. The United States and Iran commit to negotiating a final deal within 60 days, extendable by mutual consent. The U.S. begins removing its naval blockade immediately and fully ends it within 30 days. Iran reopens the Strait of Hormuz to commercial traffic with no toll, but only for 60 days. After that, Iran and Oman negotiate the future administration of the strait. Now, let that sink in. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's crude oil flows, was open and free before this war started. Now its future is subject to negotiation between Iran and its neighbors, and toll-free passage is only guaranteed for 2 months. The MOU also says Iran will maintain the current status quo of its nuclear program. It commits Iran not to develop nuclear weapons, a promise they've been making for 50 years. The enriched uranium stockpile, that gets discussed in future technical talks. Meanwhile, the U.S. issues immediate sanctions waivers for Iranian oil exports, unfreezes roughly $100 billion in Iranian assets with no restrictions on how those funds are used, and agrees to work with regional partners on a $300 billion reconstruction fund for Iran. And here's where things start to get complicated. President Trump told reporters it would be, quote, a little bit unfair for Iran not to have ballistic missiles. That's a sentence I never thought I'd hear an American president say. Now, we've got to remember something. Wars have costs, not just in dollars, but in lives, in trust, in the moral standing of a nation.
All right.
This war, 108 days of combat, cost the United States over $100 billion in direct military spending. 14 American service members were killed. More than 300 were wounded. Thousands of Iranian civilians lost their lives, including children. And the economic toll on American families? The American Enterprise Institute estimated that between rising fuel prices, diesel costs, and the ripple effects through the supply chain, the average American household was paying roughly $410 more per month because of this war. Let me tell you something from experience. The most important question a president can ask before ordering military action is not, can we win? The most important question is, what does the day after look like? Because if you don't have a clear answer to that question, if you don't have a diplomatic endgame, if you haven't built a coalition, if you haven't prepared the American people for the true cost, then you are not leading, you are gambling. And gambling with other people's lives and other people's money is not what the presidency is for. The military did its job. The pilots, the sailors, the soldiers, they performed with extraordinary courage and skill. The question is whether the commander-in-chief did his job in giving them a mission that made strategic sense with an outcome that justified what we asked them to sacrifice. Here's the honest truth, and it's a hard one. What this deal does to America's credibility may end up costing us more than the war itself. Think about the sequence. In 2018, we tore up the JCPOA, a deal our allies supported that international inspectors were verifying that was constraining Iran's nuclear program. We said it was a bad deal. We said we could do better. Then we imposed maximum pressure for years. Iran got stronger, not weaker. Then we started a war without a formal declaration from Congress, without full Allied consensus, partly justified by saying Iran was a nuclear threat that Obama's deal failed to contain. And now, 108 days and over $100 billion later, we sign a deal that, and these aren't my words alone, Senator Jack Reed, the top Democrat on armed services, says gives us less than the JCPOA did. Republican Senator Bill Cassidy called it the worst foreign policy blunder in decades. Even Lindsey Graham said the way Iran describes the deal, quote, it's awful. Now, I want you to think about what that looks like to the rest of the world, to North Korea, to China, to any country that might sit across the table from us in the future. America makes a deal, tears it up, starts a war, spends a fortune, loses lives, and then signs a worse deal than the one it walked away from. When you start governing by memorandum instead of by law, when you bypass Congress and call a framework a victory before the hard work is done, you weaken the very system that makes America's word worth something. Now look, I understand politics. I've been in the arena, and I can see exactly what's happening here. Senator Reid pointed out that Trump turned 80 on June 15th, the same day the deal was first announced. He wanted to give himself a birthday present, and the staging tells you everything. The G7 summit in Avion, the dinner at Versailles, the ceremonial signing in Switzerland, still scheduled for Friday. This is a production designed to look like triumph, but the ground underneath is shaking. Democrats like Chuck Schumer are calling it one of the biggest American disasters. Elizabeth Warren says she can't see how it helps a single American family. Chris Murphy, and he sits on foreign relations, called it, quote, essentially a surrender to Iran on Iran's terms. And he said he'd support it anyway, because the alternative, continuing a war run by what he called incompetent national security leaders, was worse. Think about that for a moment. Democrats are backing a deal they believe is a capitulation, because ending a bad war on bad terms is still better than letting it continue. Meanwhile, Republican senators like Cornyn, Tillis, and Cassidy are expressing deep skepticism. Polling shows Americans disapprove of the war. Trump's economic approval ratings have dropped even among his own base, and the midterms are coming. That tells you everything you need to know about where this war has left us. When both sides are unhappy, and the best argument for the deal is that the alternative is worse. So where does this go from here? The MOU gives 60 days to negotiate a final deal, but every hard question has been pushed into that window. The enriched uranium stockpile that Iran has buried deep underground, Trump himself admitted it would take great work and a lot of time to deal with. The verification and monitoring mechanisms, not yet designed. The future of sanctions, conditional on a final deal that doesn't exist yet. The $300 billion reconstruction fund, details to be determined. Lebanon and Hezbollah. Israel says it won't withdraw. Iran says the ceasefire covers Lebanon, and nobody has reconciled those positions. And Trump told reporters the 60 days is not a hard deadline. Iran can take longer, quote, as long as they're behaving. Now, I see three possible paths forward. The best case, and I hope for it, is that the negotiators use these 60 days to hammer out a real, verifiable agreement with meaningful nuclear controls and genuine IAEA access. That would be a good outcome, and I would support it regardless of who gets the credit. The most likely case, based on everything I've seen in decades of watching these negotiations, is that the talks stall, the deadline gets extended, and a new status quo quietly freezes into place. Iran keeping its enriched uranium, enjoying sanctions relief, and exporting oil, with no final agreement ever signed. And the worst case is that talks collapse entirely, and we're right back where we started, except Iran is now stronger, richer, and more entrenched. And remember, toll-free passage for the Strait of Hormuz is only guaranteed for 60 days. After that, Iran negotiates the future of that waterway. That right there is the part most people don't realize. And so, folks, here's where I want to leave you tonight. Not with anger, not with blame, but with a clear-eyed understanding of where we are and what has to happen next. The lesson of this moment is not that diplomacy failed. Diplomacy didn't fail. Diplomacy was abandoned in 2018 when we tore up a deal that was working. Everything that's happened since, the escalation, the maximum pressure, the war, the chaos, and now this memorandum, has been one long, expensive, painful attempt to get back to a table that America chose to leave. And we got back to that table in a weaker position than when we left it. That's not a partisan statement. That's an observable fact. So what do we do now? We demand congressional oversight.
Okay, I need to back it up a little bit, y'all. I missed something.
That was constraining Iran's nuclear program. The military did its job. The pilots, the sailors, the soldiers, they performed with extraordinary courage and skill. The question is whether the commander-in-chief did his job in giving them a mission that made strategic sense with an outcome that justified what we asked them to sacrifice. Here's the honest truth, and it's a hard one. What this deal does to America's credibility may end up costing us more than the war itself. Think about the sequence. In 2018, we tore up the JCPOA, a deal our allies supported that international inspectors were verifying that was constraining Iran's nuclear program. We said it was a bad deal. We said we could do better. Then we imposed maximum pressure for years. Iran got stronger, not weaker. Then we started a war without a formal declaration from Congress, without full Allied consensus, partly justified by saying Iran was a nuclear threat that Obama's deal failed to contain. And now, 108 days and over $100 billion later, we sign a deal that, and these aren't my words alone, Senator Jack Reed, the top Democrat on armed services, says gives us less than the JCPOA did. Republican Senator Bill Cassidy called it the worst foreign policy blunder in decades. Even Lindsey Graham said the way Iran describes the deal, quote, "It's awful." Now, I want you to think about what that looks like to the rest of the world, to North Korea, to China, to any country that might sit across the table from us in the future. America makes a deal, tears it up, starts a war, spends a fortune, loses lives, and then signs a worse deal than the one it walked away from. When you start governing by memorandum instead of by law, when you bypass Congress and call a framework a victory before the hard work is done, you weaken the very system that makes America's word worth something. Now look, I understand politics. I've been in the arena, and I can see exactly what's happening here. Senator Reid pointed out that Trump turned 80 on June 15th, the same day the deal was first announced. He wanted to give himself a birthday present, and the staging tells you everything. The G7 summit in Avion, the dinner at Versailles, the ceremonial signing in Switzerland, still scheduled for Friday. This is a production designed to look like triumph, but the ground underneath is shaking. Democrats like Chuck Schumer are calling it one of the biggest American disasters. Elizabeth Warren says she can't see how it helps a single American family. Chris Murphy, and he sits on foreign relations, called it, quote, essentially a surrender to Iran on Iran's terms. And he said he'd support it anyway, because the alternative, continuing a war run by what he called incompetent national security leaders, was worse. Think about that for a moment. Democrats are backing a deal they believe is a capitulation, because ending a bad war on bad terms is still better than letting it continue. Meanwhile, Republican senators like Cornyn, Tillis, and Cassidy are expressing deep skepticism. Polling shows Americans disapprove of the war. Trump's economic approval ratings have dropped even among his own base, and the midterms are coming. That tells you everything you need to know about where this war has left us. When both sides are unhappy, and the best argument for the deal is that the alternative is worse. So where does this go from here? The MOU gives 60 days to negotiate a final deal, but every hard question has been pushed into that window. The enriched uranium stockpile that Iran has buried deep underground, Trump himself admitted it would take great work and a lot of time to deal with. The verification and monitoring mechanisms, not yet designed. The future of sanctions, conditional on a final deal that doesn't exist yet. The $300 billion reconstruction fund, details to be determined. Lebanon and Hezbollah. Israel says it won't withdraw. Iran says the ceasefire covers Lebanon, and nobody has reconciled those positions. And Trump told reporters the 60 days is not a hard deadline. Iran can take longer, quote, as long as they're behaving. Now, I see three possible paths forward. The best case, and I hope for it, is that the negotiators use these 60 days to hammer out a real, verifiable agreement with meaningful nuclear controls and genuine IAEA access. That would be a good outcome, and I would support it regardless of who gets the credit. The most likely case, based on everything I've seen in decades of watching these negotiations, is that the talks stall, the deadline gets extended, and a new status quo quietly freezes into place. Iran keeping its enriched uranium, enjoying sanctions relief, and exporting oil, with no final agreement ever signed. And the worst case is that talks collapse entirely, and we're right back where we started, except Iran is now stronger, richer, and more entrenched. And remember, toll-free passage to the Strait of Hormuz is only guaranteed for 60 days. After that, Iran negotiates the future of that waterway. That right there is the part most people don't realize. And so, folks, here's where I want to leave you tonight. Not with anger, not with blame, but with a clear-eyed understanding of where we are and what has to happen next. The lesson of this moment is not that diplomacy failed. Diplomacy didn't fail. Diplomacy was abandoned in 2018 when we tore up a deal that was working.
Right.
Everything that's happened since, the escalation, the maximum pressure, the war, the chaos, and now this memorandum, has been one long, expensive, painful attempt to get back to a table that America chose to leave. And we got back to that table in a weaker position than when we left it. That's not a partisan statement. That's an observable fact. So what do we do now? We demand congressional oversight of any final agreement. We insist on full public release and genuine debate. We hold our leaders accountable, not with rhetoric, but with votes. And we remember that the strength of American foreign policy has never come from the size of our bombs. It has come from the reliability of our word, the steadiness of our alliances, and the wisdom to know when force is necessary and when it is not. We've been through harder things than this. Vietnam, Iraq, moments where we overreached, where we lost our way, where the cost of our mistakes was measured in lives and treasure and broken trust. And every time we found our way back. But finding your way back requires honesty. It requires admitting where you went wrong. And right now, that is the conversation this country needs to have. Not tomorrow, not after the midterms, right now. Because the American people deserve a foreign policy built on truth, built on strategy, and built on accountability, not photo ops in palaces. And I still believe, with everything in me, that we are capable of exactly that.
Okay, I got one more we need to touch bases on coming after that. Bear with me. Y'all, please hit the like button. This is about the divorce that's going on with Trump and Bibi Netanyahu.
The way it always does for empires, there's a particular kind of clarity that arrives only after catastrophe. Not before, not during, only after. When the smoke clears, when the bodies are counted, when the treasury statements arrive, and the numbers refuse to lie. And right now, in the summer of 2026, that clarity is... There's a particular kind of clarity that arrives only after catastrophe. Not before, not during, only after. When the smoke clears, when the bodies are counted, when the treasury statements arrive, and the numbers refuse to lie. And right now, in the summer of 2026, that clarity is arriving for the United States of America. It is arriving slowly, painfully, the way it always does for empires that have confused loyalty with submission and strategy with sentiment.
Please hit the like button.
Let us begin with a simple question, not a rhetorical one, a genuinely serious one, that almost nobody in Washington has had the intellectual courage to ask out loud.
Disastrous.
How did the most powerful military and economic civilization in human history come to subordinate its own foreign policy to the domestic political survival of a man facing multiple criminal indictments in a country the size of New Jersey? That is the question. Everything else is commentary. Benjamin Netanyahu has been at the center of Israeli politics for 30 years. 30 years. Think about what that means. When Netanyahu first became prime minister in 1996, the Oslo peace process was still alive, however, barely. The Palestinian Authority existed with at least a theoretical mandate. The Arab world had not yet fractured into the catastrophic geometry of failed states and proxy wars that defines it today. Iran had not yet enriched uranium to the degree it now has. Hezbollah was a militia, not a state within a state. And the United States was, for all its contradictions, still a nation that at least performed the pretense of international law. 30 years later, almost every one of those conditions has been reversed. And Netanyahu was not a bystander to that reversal. He was its architect. Not the sole architect. American complicity runs deep, and we will get to that. But the man who understood better than almost anyone how to weaponize the American political system's particular vulnerabilities. Its evangelical base, its campaign finance architecture, its media ecosystem, its deep-seated inability to distinguish between...
Are y'all still with me or have y'all fallen asleep? Can y'all give me a thumbs up or a one or something in the comment section and let me know that y'all are still with me, that I'm not just up here providing this information in vain. Y'all still with me? Now I'm sleepy. Are y'all still with me? I'm gonna shut this down if y'all not here. Am I buffing? Are y'all with me? Can I get some ones or a thumb up? Let me know that y'all... Okay. Thank you. Okay, I see y'all. Hi, Clarence.
criticism of a government and hate how to weaponize the American political system's particular vulnerabilities. Its evangelical base, its campaign finance architecture, its media ecosystem, its deep-seated inability to distinguish between criticism of a government and hatred of a people. He exploited all of it, masterfully, for 3 decades. And now, in what may be the most dramatic diplomatic rupture in the history of the U.S.-Israel relationship, Donald Trump, of all people, appears to be the one finally saying, enough. I want to sit with that irony for a moment because it deserves more than a passing acknowledgement. The man who moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, the man who recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights in violation of international law, the man who dismantled the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, one of the most carefully negotiated non-proliferation agreements of the modern era. That man is now, in the summer of 2026, seated next to Emmanuel Macron in Paris, announcing a ceasefire with Iran, telling reporters the Strait of Hormuz is reopening, and using language about Netanyahu that diplomatic protocol normally forbids. He reportedly told Netanyahu, "Everybody hates you." And then, with characteristic Trumpian precision, added, "Everybody hates Israel." Now, you can object to the bluntness, you can wince at the crudeness, but you cannot, if you are being intellectually honest, deny the underlying truth of the statement. The Pew Research Center's Global Opinion Surveys, released just last month, showed exactly this, that Israel's standing in world public opinion has collapsed to historic lows. Not because the world has suddenly become anti-Semitic. That explanation is not only lazy, it is an insult to the genuine complexity of what has happened. Israel's standing has collapsed because of what Israel has been doing, visibly, in real time, with American weapons, American diplomatic cover, and American money. A genocide in Gaza, an annexation of the West Bank proceeding in full view of international institutions that can observe, but apparently cannot act. An invasion of Lebanon, a war against Iran that by any serious strategic assessment should never have been fought, was always going to be unwinnable in any conventional sense, and has produced economic damage that will take years to calculate and decades to recover from. And at the center of all of it, always, Netanyahu. Let us talk about the Iran war, because it deserves a level of intellectual seriousness that the cable news cycle has been largely incapable of providing. On February 28th of this year, the United States and Israel launched military operations against Iran. The stated justification was Iran's nuclear program. The actual motivation, if you listen carefully to what Netanyahu himself said on the first day of operations, was something he described as a dream he had carried for 40 years. 40 years. He wanted regime change in Tehran. He wanted the Islamic Republic dismantled. He wanted to choose Iran's next government. Think about the delusionality embedded in that ambition. Iran is not Libya. Iran is not Iraq in 2003, already hollowed out by a decade of sanctions and the aftermath of its own devastating war with Iraq. Iran is a nation of more than 90 million people with a sophisticated military, ballistic missile capabilities that can reach every American base in the region. A population that, whatever its disagreements with its own government, has a centuries-deep sense of national identity and a particular historically grounded suspicion of Western intervention. The last time a Western power tried to orchestrate regime change in Iran, it was 1953. and the CIA-backed coup that removed Mohammad Mossadegh is still, 70 years later, a living wound in Iranian national consciousness. To imagine that you could in one day kill the leadership and choose the next leader, as was apparently the operational theory, is not strategic thinking. It is not even fantasy. It is something closer to a clinical detachment from reality, dressed up in the language of national security. And yet the United States went along with it. Donald Trump, who had spent much of his first term presenting himself as the president who would end the forever wars, who would bring troops home, who understood that regime change is a fool's errand. That man signed off on this operation. Why? The answer, I think, has several layers. The first is the personal dynamic between Trump and Netanyahu, which has always been less a relationship between equals and more a relationship between a flatterer and a man who requires flattery. Netanyahu understood Trump's psychological architecture with extraordinary precision. He knew how to make Trump feel like the architect of historic events. The Abraham Accords, the embassy move, the Golan recognition. Each of these was packaged and presented as Trump's singular achievement, his alone, proof of his genius where all previous presidents had failed. Netanyahu gave Trump the thing Trump most craves, the sense of historical magnitude. The second layer is the domestic political economy of American Israel policy, which operates through mechanisms that have no real parallel in how the United States manages its relationship with any other foreign government. The financial flows, the lobbying architecture, the concentration of pro-Israel voices in media ownership, the evangelical theological investment in Israel's territorial expansion as a precondition for eschatological events. All of this creates a structural environment in which any American politician who questions the relationship, however carefully, however precisely, does so at significant personal and professional risk. The third layer, and this is the one that I think is most important to understand if you want to grasp what is happening right now in June of 2026, is that the American political system has, for decades, lacked the institutional capacity for honest cost-benefit analysis when it comes to Israel. The costs get buried, the benefits get amplified, the strategic liabilities get reframed as moral obligations. And the very act of raising the question is immediately conflated with a hostility that shuts down conversation before it can begin. That capacity for honest accounting is now, finally, being forced upon the system, not by intellectual awakening, but by the sheer weight of consequences that have become impossible to ignore. The Strait of Hormuz was closed for months. Think about what that means in terms of global oil supply chains, in terms of shipping insurance rates, in terms of the cost of every imported good that arrives by sea. The countries of the global south, which is to say most of humanity, experienced this as an economic catastrophe not of their making, and for which they bore a wildly disproportionate cost. And they said so in forums, in bilateral communications, in the blunt language that governments use when they have decided that diplomatic niceties are no longer serving their interests. Trump was hearing it from everywhere. You and Israel are destroying the world economy. Stop. The American voter was hearing it too. Polls showed overwhelming opposition to the war among the American public, not just among progressives, not just among Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, but across the political spectrum. Americans who had voted for Trump, who supported his domestic agenda, who approved of his economic nationalism, those voters did not want to be at war with Iran. They did not understand why they were at war with Iran. And they were right not to understand, because there was never a coherent strategic rationale that could withstand serious examination. And so Trump, who is above all a political animal with extraordinary instincts for his own survival, began to recalibrate. The shift in his language about Netanyahu over the past week has been striking. Not just the "everybody hates you" comment, though that alone would have been unthinkable even 6 months ago. The overall register has changed. The warmth has curdled. The public embrace has been replaced by something that looks, from the outside, like genuine frustration, possibly genuine anger. Netanyahu, for his part, has responded in the only way he knows how, by publicly insisting that he and Trump many times see eye to eye, while simultaneously making clear to his domestic audience that he is standing firm on Israeli security interests. It is a performance of loyalty designed to be read differently by different audiences simultaneously. Netanyahu has always been extraordinarily skilled at this kind of double-register communication. It is, arguably, his greatest political gift. But the question now is whether that gift is still sufficient. Because the conditions that made it effective for 30 years are changing. The United States is extricating itself, imperfectly, incompletely, in the chaotic and non-linear way that American foreign policy always extricates itself from its disasters, from the Iran war. The ceasefire agreement, such as it is, involves a staged process, a partial opening of the Strait now, a full opening by Friday, negotiations over the nuclear portfolio over the next 60 days, and the gradual unfreezing of Iranian assets, Iran's own money, let us be precise about this, that the United States has been holding in what can only be described as financial hostage-taking. The scale of what has been done to Iran economically deserves to be named clearly. The United States, through its control of the global dollar system, has the ability to cut any country off from the international financial order. Not because of any law, not because of any treaty obligation, but because of raw power. It has used this power against Venezuela, against Cuba, against Russia, against North Korea, against Afghanistan, against Iran. The Treasury Secretary publicly boasted earlier this year about how the U.S. had deliberately broken the Iranian currency, the Iranian banking system, and the Iranian economy. He called it economic statecraft. It is, in fact, a form of collective punishment visited upon civilian populations who had no role in whatever policy dispute led to their country's designation as an enemy. Iran's money, estimates suggest somewhere in the range of $200 to $400 billion, frozen across various jurisdictions due to U.S. sanctions pressure, is Iran's own sovereign wealth, not U.S. money. Not money held because of any legitimate legal judgment. Money that belongs to a nation of 90 million people, held because the United States decided to use economic asphyxiation as a tool of regime change. The agreement apparently involves releasing some portion of this, $24 billion in stages, beginning with $12 billion in the next 30 days. $12 billion for a country of 90 million people, Iran's own money, returned as if it were a concession. I raise this not to defend the Iranian government, whose record on human rights is genuinely troubling, whose treatment of its own people, particularly women, particularly minorities, particularly political dissidents, deserves serious condemnation. I raise it because the way we discuss American foreign policy requires us to be honest about the instruments being used in our name and the legal and moral framework, or lack thereof, within which they operate. Seizing a sovereign nation's assets because you disapprove of its government is gangsterism. That is the word for it. And naming it accurately is a prerequisite for thinking clearly about it. Now, Lebanon. The report suggests Lebanon is part of the ceasefire framework. This too requires honest description. Israel invaded Lebanon, full stop. This was not a response to an imminent existential threat. It was an invasion, part of the broader regional campaign that has included Gaza, the West Bank, Syria, and now Iran. The Israeli government has, in Netanyahu's construction, been pursuing Greater Israel, a vision of territorial and strategic dominance over the entire Eastern Mediterranean region at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives, trillions of dollars in regional economic damage, and the systematic destruction of whatever remained of the rules-based international order in the Middle East. 3 senior Israeli government officials currently have arrest warrants outstanding from the International Criminal Court. The Prime Minister of Israel is one of them. The United States has blocked enforcement of those warrants. This is where American complicity becomes material rather than merely rhetorical. When you use your Security Council veto to shield war criminals from accountability, you become implicated in their actions in ways that are not metaphorical. What happens now is genuinely uncertain, which is a different thing from unknowable. Netanyahu will attempt to torpedo this agreement. He has done it before. In 2015, he flew to Washington uninvited by the Obama administration and addressed a joint session of Congress in an effort to kill the JCPOA before it was finalized. It was an extraordinary breach of diplomatic protocol, a foreign leader using the American legislative chamber as a stage to undermine the foreign policy of the American executive. And it worked, eventually, in the sense that Trump pulled out of the JCPOA in 2018. But Netanyahu's toolkit is more constrained now than it was then. He needs the United States in three specific ways: militarily, financially, and diplomatically. Without American weapons, the Israeli military cannot sustain extended operations. Without American financial support, the Israeli economy, already under significant strain from the costs of continuous warfare, faces serious structural challenges. Without American diplomatic cover at the UN Security Council, Israeli actions in Gaza, the West Bank, and Lebanon become subject to enforceable international consequences rather than merely symbolic condemnations. If Trump holds firm, and that is a significant conditional, Netanyahu's options narrow dramatically. Naftali Bennett, Netanyahu's main political rival and former prime minister, was quoted this week saying something illuminating: that the day there is a change of government in Israel is the day the war against Iran resumes. He was not presenting this as a warning. He was presenting it as a promise, a statement of intent, which tells you something important. This is not a conflict between hawks and doves in Israeli politics. It is a conflict between hawks who want to continue the current war and hawks who believe the current war was mismanaged. The Israeli political mainstream has internalized Greater Israel. The question is only about tactics, not direction, which means, to be blunt, that American pressure is the only lever that changes the trajectory. There is no Israeli political movement capable of doing it from within, at least not at the scale and speed that circumstances require. And this brings us to the deepest question, which is also the most uncomfortable one. Is the United States capable of exercising that pressure with consistency and discipline over time? The historical record is not encouraging. American foreign policy has a well-documented tendency toward what you might call strategic amnesia, the capacity to oscillate between moments of apparent clarity and extended periods of drift, captured by the very interest groups whose influence the moment of clarity was supposed to correct. The Israel lobby, and I use that term descriptively, not pejoratively, is extraordinarily well organized, extraordinarily well funded, and has decades of experience navigating precisely these kinds of moments. They will wait, they will work the congressional relationships, they will mobilize the media architecture, they will frame any sustained American pressure on Israel as a betrayal, as anti-Semitism, as the abandonment of America's most important democratic ally. They have done it before, they will do it again. The question is whether the costs of the last year, the economic damage, the military stalemate, the global alienation, the domestic political backlash have produced a sufficient shift in the underlying political economy that this time the pressure holds. Whether enough of the American political class has absorbed the lesson that Netanyahu's project is not in American interests, has never been in American interests, and will continue to cost American lives and American treasure as long as the United States allows itself to be instrumentalized in its service. I want to be careful here not to end on false optimism. The ceasefire is real, but it is provisional. The staged process that supposedly follows has enormous opportunities for disruption. The nuclear question, which is supposedly to be resolved within 60 days, is the hardest question of all. Not because Iran particularly wants a nuclear weapon. Iranian leaders have been saying for 25 years that they do not, and the Quran explicitly prohibits weapons of mass destruction under most mainstream Islamic jurisprudence. But because the negotiation has to navigate the domestic political constraints of every party involved, including a Trump administration that needs to show its domestic audience it got something, and an Iranian government that needs to show its domestic audience that capitulation under fire is not what happened. And there is the matter of ICE agents dragging graduate students out of dormitories. of a president who reportedly contemplated suspending habeas corpus, of tariffs imposed without legal authority that transferred $140 billion from American households to corporations and then were reversed, with the corporations keeping the money.
Wow.
The decay of constitutional norms is not separate from the decay of international ones. They are expressions of the same underlying pathology: the substitution of power for law, the treatment of legal constraints as obstacles to be managed rather than principles to be honored. What you're watching in the summer of 2026 is a civilization grappling with the consequences of several decades of choices that felt, in the moment, like exercises of power, but were in fact accelerating forms of self-destruction. The addiction to military solutions, the reliance on economic coercion as a substitute for diplomacy, the confusion of the interests of a particular foreign government with the interests of the United States itself, the erosion of the domestic legal order as a kind of collateral damage from the erosion of international legal norms. Whether this particular moment, this particular ceasefire, this particular rupture between Trump and Netanyahu represents something genuinely new or merely another oscillation in the long cycle of American foreign policy dysfunction is a question that cannot be answered yet. History does not deliver verdicts in real time. It delivers evidence, and the evidence takes years to assemble into anything like a coherent interpretation. What I can say is this: the Strait of Hormuz is partially reopening. Iran is getting some of its own money back. Lebanon is apparently in the framework. The right-wing extremists in Netanyahu's coalition are having, in the delightful phrase of one commentator, an absolute fit. And the President of the United States is sitting in Paris, next to the French President, using language about the Israeli Prime Minister that would have been considered unthinkable 12 months ago. Is that progress? By the standard of where we were in February, yes. By the standard of what justice and international law actually require, it is a very small step in a very long journey that has barely begun. The deeper work, the work of rebuilding a Middle East policy that serves American interests and human dignity simultaneously, of dismantling the lobbying architecture that has made rational policymaking structurally impossible, of reestablishing the legal norms at home and abroad that governance requires, that work has not started. It may not start for years, it may not start at all, but at least today the strait is opening, the ships are moving, and for the first time in a very long time, the question of whether the United States can free itself from the grip of Netanyahu's 30-year project has an answer that is something other than an automatic no. That is not hope, it is not even optimism, it is simply and barely a beginning.
Okay, this right here, designed to fail. Let me see.
Stop. Before you scroll past this, I need you to understand.
Hold on, that's not the one I wanted. I wanted where they... Oh no, that's too long. Hold on.
And something that happened in the last 48 hours that almost nobody is talking about correctly. On June... Stop. Before you scroll past
y'all
this,
hit the
I
like
need
button
you to
for me.
understand something that happened in the last 48 hours that almost nobody is talking about correctly. On June 17th, 2026, while every single news channel on the planet was pointing its cameras at a palace in France, while analysts were screaming at each other about whether Trump won or lost, while stock markets were exploding upward and oil prices were crashing down, one country, thousands of miles away from all of that noise, made 3 moves that may have just permanently changed the direction of the entire world. And that country never fired a bullet, never signed a document, never even sent a diplomat to the table. And by the time you finish watching this, you are going to understand exactly why that country, China, just became the biggest winner of a war it never fought. But here's the part that is going to stay with you. The so-called peace deal everyone is celebrating right now, it appears to have been designed to fail. And when it does fall apart, what comes next will look nothing like bombs or aircraft carriers. It will look like wrappers, like nonprofits, like reconstruction money. And we have seen this exact playbook before. for. Let me show you everything. Okay, so let us start with what actually happened on June 17th, because the surface level story is not the real story. On that day, Trump signs what is being called the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding with Iran. The Strait of Hormuz reopens. Oil prices crash. Wall Street surges. Every anchor on every channel is talking about diplomacy, about deals, about winners and losers. And look, I get it. On the surface, this is a massive story. The Strait of Hormuz alone carries somewhere around 20% of the world's entire oil supply. When that thing is blocked, the whole global economy starts to feel it. So yes, reopening it matters. That is real. But here's what nobody is asking. While all of that was happening, while the cameras were locked on Versailles, while Washington was managing the domestic political optics of this deal, while Tehran was figuring out how to explain this to its own hardliners, what was Beijing doing? Because Beijing was not watching. Beijing was moving. Now, to understand what China did, I want to give you a concept. And this concept is going to change the way you think about geopolitics forever. It is called the outside benefactor strategy. Think about it like this. Imagine two restaurants on the same street. They are going at each other hard, cutting prices, running promotions, fighting for every single customer. They are both bleeding money. And while they are doing that, 2 blocks over, a third restaurant quietly opens. Better chefs, better menu, better experience, no distractions. And within a year, both of those fighting restaurants have lost most of their customers to the one that never entered the fight. That is the outside benefactor strategy. And on June 17th and 18th, 2026, China executed it with surgical precision. Here is China's first move. And I want you to really pay attention here, because this one is the most significant thing that happened that entire week. On the exact same day that the Iran deal was being signed, China released a document called the Global Governance Initiative, the GGI. And I want to be precise about what this is. This is not a vague policy statement. This is a blueprint, a structural proposal for how the world should be organized and governed going forward. And on that same day, nearly 160 countries signed on to it. Think about that number for a second. 160 nations. That is almost double the membership of NATO. That is more than 3/4 of the United Nations. And what does this document say? It says the world should be multipolar. It says no single nation should be able to unilaterally impose its rules on everyone else. It explicitly challenges what Beijing calls the era of American hegemony. Now, you might say, okay, China has been saying that kind of thing for years. What is different this time? And that is exactly the right question. Here is what is different. On that same day, China did not just release a document. They announced 3 brand new international organizations. The World AI Cooperation Organization, headquartered in Shanghai. The World Data Organization, headquartered in Beijing. The International Mediation Organization, headquartered in Hong Kong.
Sorry.
3 organizations, one day. Does that make sense? Now think about winners and losers. And look, I get it. About winners and losers. And look, I get it. On the surface, this is a massive story. The Strait of Hormuz alone carries somewhere around 20% of the world's entire oil supply. When that thing is blocked, the whole global economy starts to feel it. So yes, reopening it matters. That is real. But here's what nobody is asking. While all of that was happening, while the cameras were locked on Versailles, while Washington was managing the domestic political optics of this deal, while Tehran was figuring out how to explain this to its own hardliners, what was Beijing doing? Because Beijing was not watching. Beijing was moving. Now, to understand what China did, I want to give you a concept, and this concept is going to change the way you think about geopolitics forever. It is called the outside benefactor strategy. Think about it like this. Imagine 2 restaurants on the same street. They are going at each other hard, cutting prices, running promotions, fighting for every single customer. They are both bleeding money. And while they are doing that, 2 blocks over, a third restaurant quietly opens. Better chefs, better menu, better experience, no distractions. And within a year, both of those fighting restaurants have lost most of their customers to the one that never entered the fight. That is the outside benefactor strategy. And on June 17th and 18th, 2026, China executed it with surgical precision. Here is China's first move. And I want you to really pay attention here, because this one is the most significant thing that happened that entire week. On the exact same day that the Iran deal was being signed, China released a document called the Global Governance Initiative, the GGI. And I want to be precise about what this is. This is not a vague policy statement. This is a blueprint, a structural proposal for how the world should be organized and governed going forward. And on that same day, nearly 160 countries signed on to it. Think about that number for a second. 160 nations. That is almost double the membership of NATO. That is more than 3/4 of the United Nations. And what does this document say? It says the world should be multipolar. It says no single nation should be able to unilaterally impose its rules on everyone else. It explicitly challenges what Beijing calls the era of American hegemony. Now, you might say, okay, China has been saying that kind of thing for years. What is different this time? And that is exactly the right question. Here is what is different. On that same day, China did not just release a document. They announced 3 brand new international organizations. The World AI Cooperation Organization, headquartered in Shanghai. The World Data Organization, headquartered in Beijing. The International Mediation Organization, headquartered in Hong Kong. 3 organizations, one day. Does that make sense? Now think about what those 3 things actually represent. Artificial intelligence, data infrastructure, international dispute resolution. These are not random. These are the 3 foundational pillars of geopolitical power in the 21st century. Whoever controls the rules of AI development, whoever manages the global data architecture, whoever runs the table when nations have conflicts, That is who runs the world. And China just planted its institutional flag in all three of them. On its own soil, on the single day the entire world was looking somewhere else. That is not coincidence. That is choreography. Here is where it gets interesting. Because China's second move happened simultaneously, and it got almost zero coverage. In Shanghai, at a forum called the Lujiazui Forum, the governor of China's central bank made several announcements that, when you line them up, tell a very specific story. First, he announced that foreign central banks and sovereign wealth funds can now borrow Chinese liquidity by using Chinese government bonds as collateral. In plain language, foreign governments can now access Chinese currency financing without going through the US dollar system at all. Second, China's largest state banks were permitted to trade offshore yuan foreign exchange directly from within the Shanghai Free Trade Zone. This is the internationalization of the Chinese currency accelerating at a speed we have not seen before. And third, and this one is important, China announced it will legally penalize any foreign entity that tries to pressure Chinese companies through sanctions. They are not just resisting American financial pressure tools anymore. They are building a legal framework that treats those tools as illegal from their own perspective. And combine all of that with what happened in the trade talks. Because of the inflation pressure caused by the Hormuz blockade, American negotiators agreed to remove tariffs on $30 billion worth of Chinese imports. And in those negotiations, American officials acknowledged on the record that the manufacturing capacity behind those goods will, in their words, never return to America. Never. Analysts watching those talks are describing the outcome as a deal struck almost entirely on China's terms. China gave no concessions on its industrial subsidies, no movement on the structural trade imbalance. It simply waited while America was squeezed by economic pressure and then collected. Now think about what that actually means. The most powerful economy in the world walked into a negotiating room under domestic inflation pressure and gave away $30 billion in trade concessions without receiving a single structural reform in return. That is not leverage. That is desperation. And Beijing knows exactly what it is looking at. China's third move is the one that is most underreported, and some analysts suggest it may be the most consequential of all. While Washington was managing the political aftermath of the Iran agreement, the Nature Index, one of the world's most credible trackers of scientific research output, released data showing that China has now surpassed the United States to claim the #1 global position in chemistry, accounting for 53% of total global output. 53%. Let that sit for a moment. China is also leading or rapidly closing gaps in physical sciences, applied sciences, and pharmaceutical biotechnology. Chinese biotech firms are using artificial intelligence to compress drug development timelines from years down to months. Meanwhile, on the same day in Washington, the U.S. Federal Reserve announced it is holding interest rates at 3.5 to 3.75%, with signals that rates will stay elevated for an extended period. And what do high interest rates mean in practice? Investment slows. Research budgets shrink. The competitiveness of American companies weakens over time. So while America's financial conditions are tightening the screws on domestic innovation, China is pouring resources into the scientific breakthroughs that will define the next economic generation. Let me say this one more time slowly, because I want it to land. China did not start this conflict. China did not fight in it. China did not lose a single aircraft carrier or spend a single dollar on munitions in the Persian Gulf. And in the same 24-hour window where America was signing what many observers are calling a historically difficult deal, China restructured the architecture of global governance, took concrete steps to displace the dollar in international finance, extracted trade concessions from a weakened America, and surpassed the United States in multiple scientific fields. One player, no bullets, 3 moves. That is the outside benefactor strategy in real time. Okay, now I want to shift the conversation inward, because the China story is the outside story. There is a completely separate story happening inside Iran. And to understand that story, I need to ask you one question. Does America actually want real, lasting peace with Iran? I am going to argue, based on the structure of this agreement itself, that the answer appears to be no, and here is why. Look at the nuclear clause of this MOU. It requires Iran to dilute its highly enriched uranium, what experts call HEU, on site, inside Iran, under supervision from the International Atomic Energy Agency. Sounds reasonable, but here's the problem. Iran has publicly stated that it does not view the IAEA as a neutral body. Their position, not speculation. And respected Iran analysts at institutions like the Council on Foreign Relations have stated on the record that if Iran maintains that position, any nuclear agreement simply cannot be adequately verified. Additionally, Iran agreed only to dilute its uranium in place, under its own conditions, on its own timeline, at facilities it controls. That creates a verification gap so large that it almost guarantees future disagreement over compliance. And the Americans know this. The CIA director and the Secretary of State both communicated serious doubts, publicly and privately, about whether Iran would actually follow through on its nuclear commitments. These are not critics of the administration. These are Trump's own people. So what did Trump say in response? At the G7 summit, on the same day the deal was signed, he said, and I am paraphrasing here, not quoting directly, that if Iran does not come through, military action is very much on the table. And senior U.S. officials told reporters that if Iran is seen as stalling or deceiving, the U.S. would return to maximum pressure extremely quickly. Now think about the logical structure of what I just described. You sign an agreement. You know the verification mechanism will not work because the other side rejects the referee. You attach a 60-day deadline with a military threat to it, and your own intelligence leadership is telling you the other side will likely fail to comply. That is not a peace deal. That appears to be a trap with a diplomatic bow tied around it. The purpose of this agreement, one possible explanation was narrow and short-term. Reopen the Hormuz Strait, stop the oil shock, stabilize the market, and give the administration domestic political cover. After 60 days, when verification demands are not met, as many analysts expect, America has a clean, internationally defensible justification to declare Iran in violation and shift to the next phase of pressure. But here's what I really want you to think about. The next phase of pressure is not going to look like bombing campaigns, because military action has already proven too costly, too slow, and insufficient to achieve the actual strategic objective. The next wave, it appears, is going to look like something America has deployed before, something quieter, something with no fingerprints that trace back to Washington. And to understand what that looks like, you need to understand what happened in Bangladesh in 2024. In August 2024, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, who had governed Bangladesh for 15 years and overseen one of the fastest growing economies in South Asia, fled her own country within hours. From the outside, it looked like a spontaneous student uprising. And yes, there were genuine grievances among the population. I am not dismissing that. But look at the infrastructure behind the uprising. USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy funneled significant funding into Bangladeshi civil society through organizations working on, among other things, what they called fighting disinformation. A USAID-connected think tank published a document outlining strategies for controlling information flow, coordinating with technology companies to suppress government narratives, and amplifying opposition voices. And here's the detail that I find most striking. They did not just fund politicians, they funded artists. A lawyer-turned-rapper named Tafi Ahmed received support to produce music videos that went viral on Facebook and YouTube, deliberately targeting urban youth, mobilizing young people emotionally in a way no political pamphlet ever could. You do not need a party. You do not need a manifesto. You just need a song on a 20-year-old's phone that plays enough times. A program called PARS explicitly identified marginalized communities, ethnic minorities, students, LGBTQ-identified individuals, as the most effective vectors for spreading reform messaging because they are harder for governments to suppress and more effective at reaching broader audiences. Within 6 months of this infrastructure activating at scale, Sheikh Hasina was gone. Muhammad Yunus, a figure with close ties to American elite institutions, was installed. And Bangladesh entered a period of significant instability. Police collapse, mob violence, the rise of extremist groups, while Washington had a friendly face in the seat of power. Now let me connect every single dot to Iran, because this is where it gets very important. Article 2 of the Islamabad MOU explicitly states that the United States will not interfere in Iran's internal affairs. Sounds like a clean commitment, but USAID is not official interference. The National Endowment for Democracy is not official interference. NGOs are not official interference. A $300 billion reconstruction fund flowing through private channels and nonprofits is not official interference. These are the exact same mechanisms used in Bangladesh, and they all operate in the space between official government action and completely deniable private activity. And there is already plenty of raw material inside Iran to work with. A women's rights movement that has been building for years, a Kurdish minority in the north, urban youth who have been economically devastated by years of sanctions and blockades, young people who are online, already angry, already looking for someone to explain their frustration to them. And critically, the Iranian government itself is fractured. When this MOU was announced, hardliners in the Iranian parliament immediately called it rushed and weak, accusing the government of abandoning the supreme leader's red lines. You have a government that signed a deal that half its own political establishment despises. That is a fault line. And fault lines can be pushed. The real strategic target, some analysts suggest, is not the elected Iranian president, who genuinely wants the deal and the reconstruction money. The target, one possible reading of this situation suggests, is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. The IRGC is the institutional backbone of the Iranian regional network. Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen. Undermine the IRGC's domestic legitimacy, fragment its political base, erode the social conditions that sustain it, and you potentially collapse that entire regional architecture without a single military strike. And you do not need bombs to accomplish that. You need money. You need musicians. You need student movements. You need nonprofits. You need trained local activists and a viral social media strategy and 60 days of ceasefire as cover while the infrastructure gets into position. I want to be transparent with you. This is analytical interpretation. This is my read of the available evidence, and I could be wrong. But here is what I would say to that. When you observe the same organizations, the same funding channels, the same targeting strategy of marginalized communities, the same media mobilization approach applied across multiple countries, across multiple administrations, at some point, one possible conclusion is that this is not coincidence. This is a pattern. So here is what to watch in the next 60 days. 3 specific things, not vague predictions, concrete signals. First, watch whether Iran allows IAEA inspectors into its nuclear facilities and under exactly what conditions. Pay attention to any Iranian restrictions on site access, advance notice requirements, or limits on sample collection. Watch how Washington characterizes those restrictions. If American officials frame them as a treaty violation, that is the moment the 60-day mechanism activates. Read IAEA statements directly. Do not rely on U.S. government summaries of them. They will say different things. Second, watch for NGO registration and civil society activity inside Iran. Any USAID affiliated, NED affiliated, or related organizations beginning to establish partnerships with Iranian civil society groups, even under labels like humanitarian assistance or educational exchange, that is the infrastructure of a soft power operation in its early stages. If you have seen the Bangladesh documents, you know what it looks like before it activates. Third, watch how many additional countries formally join or endorse the GGI in the next 60 days. If China continues expanding its diplomatic coalition, while America is absorbed in managing the Iran verification process, that is evidence that the outside benefactor strategy is producing exactly the results Beijing designed it for. Because here's the final thing I want to leave you with. June 17th and 18th, 2026. 48 hours. China launches the GGI with 160 nations behind it, establishes 3 international organizations, and claims the institutional architecture of the next world order. China extracts $30 billion in tariff concessions from an America under economic pressure, while giving nothing structural in return. China accelerates the internationalization of the yuan and builds legal defenses against American sanctions tools. China surpasses America in scientific output across multiple fields, while American interest rates constrain domestic investment. Meanwhile, Iran signs a nuclear verification deal with a referee it does not trust, under a 60-day deadline with a military threat attached, while the same institutional machinery that restructured Bangladesh in 2024 quietly begins recalibrating for a far larger target. One country walked away from those 48 hours having won without fighting a single round. One agreement appears to have been structured to fail so that a different, quieter operation could begin. and one historical playbook from 2024 is being prepared for deployment in 2026. And I want to leave you with just one question, not an answer, just a question. When America promises $300 billion to rebuild Iran, but has already prepositioned the same organizations, the same funding mechanisms, and the same civil society infrastructure it used in Bangladesh, the real question is not whether Iran will be rebuilt. The real question is, who will be sitting in the seat of power in Tehran when that rebuilding is finished? Think about that.
Do you have uncontrollable cravings for these salty and sugary foods? And you already know that it's
Islamic Republic of Iran and their allies in the current war.
So be careful about celebrating too early because Benjamin Netanyahu does have a plan to sabotage this peace deal. So let's tell you about it, and let's see if we can get past it. Anna, what's the plan?
Well, look, there have been some pretty interesting statements coming from the Prime Minister of Israel. Before we get to it, I want to just refresh everyone's memory in regard to how Lebanon plays a role in securing a real lasting peace deal with Iran. Because Lebanon is a red line for the Iranians, and they have been repeating that again and again. The United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran and their allies in the current war, by signing this MOU, this is the exact wording of the MOU, by the way, declare the immediate and permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, including in Lebanon, and undertake from now on not to initiate any war or any military operation against each other, and to refrain from the threat of use of force against each other, and ensuring the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Lebanon. The final deal will confirm the permanent termination of the war on all fronts, including in Lebanon, and other provisions of this paragraph. So I read you the exact wording of the 14-point MOU, so you're not fooled by anyone who is, pro-Israel telling you that Lebanon really has nothing to do with this. Lebanon has a lot to do with securing a final and permanent peace deal. Netanyahu knows that, which is why he insists on the IDF's offensive against Lebanon. Israel doesn't care. They want the war to keep going. So Netanyahu's statements. Let's begin with the first thought. Here's what he had to say.
ואתגרים נוספים עוד לפנינו. ואלה דורשים מאיתנו קור רוח, עמידה נחושה על האינטרסים הביטחוניים שלנו, ובד בבד שמירה על הקשר החשוב עם ידידינו האמריקנים שלחמו לצידנו כתף אל כתף, ואנחנו מעריכים זאת מאוד. אנחנו נמשיך לנווט את דרכנו בתבונה ובשיקול דעת. נשמור על הישגי הממשלה, נשמור על הישגי המלחמה. אלה הישגים של עם ישראל כולו. כשם שהזמנו.
For our audio listeners, let me go ahead and translate that for you. He says that the struggle is not over yet. More challenges still lie ahead. These require us to keep our composure, stand firm on our security interests, and at the same time maintain the important relationship with our American friends who have stood by us shoulder to shoulder, and we deeply appreciate that. We will continue to exercise judgment and discretion. We will safeguard the government's achievements. We will safeguard the achievements of the war. These are achievements of the entire people of Israel. Later, Netanyahu also says, let's go to graphic 5 here, just as we restored security and I can't believe he has the audacity to say this, restored the security and tranquility to the Gaza Strip, which, by the way, is in ruins right now, so too will we restore security and tranquility to the northern communities, meaning northern Israel. That is how we will live. Maintaining our security zone in southern Lebanon requires that we do not leave as long as Israel's security arrangements are not in place. What he's effectively saying there, in a seemingly diplomatic way, but don't be fooled, is that Israel intends to continue the war against Lebanon and also intends to continue the occupation in southern Lebanon. Further, he says, and this separation distances Hezbollah, he's pretending like this is about Hezbollah, Hezbollah. From our citizens and communities, and more broadly, we will continue to hold fast to the supreme goal that has guided us and guided me for most of my adult life, that Iran will not have a nuclear weapon, and to those who still have doubts about Israel's resolve, it will not happen.
Yeah, I keep asking y'all to hit the like button. If y'all can't do that, we can shut it down. Oh, no. That was supposed to be my next one.
Islamic Republic of Iran and their allies in the current war by signing this MOU. This is the exact wording of the MOU, by the way. And permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, including in Lebanon, and undertake from now on not to initiate any war or any military operation against each other, and to refrain from the threat of use of force against each other, and ensuring the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Lebanon. The final deal will confirm the permanent termination of the war on all fronts, including in Lebanon, and other provisions of this paragraph. So I read you the exact wording of the 14-point MOU. So you're not fooled by anyone who is, pro-Israel telling you that Lebanon really has nothing to do with this. Lebanon has a lot to do with securing a final and permanent peace deal. Netanyahu knows that, which is why he insists on the IDF's offensive against Lebanon. Israel doesn't care. They want the war to keep going. So Netanyahu's statements. Let's begin with the first thought. Here's what he had to say.
ואתגרים נוספים עוד לפנינו. ואלה דורשים מאיתנו קור רוח, עמידה נחושה על האינטרסים הביטחוניים שלנו, ובד בבד שמירה על הקשר החשוב עם ידידינו האמריקנים שלחמו לצידנו כתף אל כתף, ואנחנו מעריכים זאת מאוד. אנחנו נמשיך לנווט את דרכנו בתבונה ובשיקול דעת. לשמור על הישגי הממשלה, לשמור על הישגי המלחמה, אלה הישגים של עם ישראל כולו, כשם שהצגנו.
For our audio listeners, let me go ahead and translate that for you. He says that the struggle is not over yet. More challenges still lie ahead. These require us to keep our composure, stand firm on our security interests, and at the same time maintain the important relationship with our American friends who have stood by us shoulder to shoulder, and we deeply appreciate that. We will continue to exercise judgment and discretion. We will safeguard the government's achievements. We will safeguard the achievements of the war. These are achievements of the entire people of Israel. Later, Netanyahu also says, let's go to graphic 5 here, just as we restored security and I can't believe he has the audacity to say this, restored the security and tranquility to the Gaza Strip, which, by the way, is in ruins right now, so too will we restore security and tranquility to the northern communities, meaning northern Israel. That is how we will live. Maintaining our security zone in southern Lebanon requires that we do not leave as long as Israel's security arrangements are not in place. What he's effectively saying there, in a seemingly diplomatic way, but don't be fooled, is that Israel intends to continue the war against Lebanon and also intends to continue the occupation in southern Lebanon. Further, he says, and this separation distances Hezbollah, he's pretending like this is about Hezbollah, from our citizens and communities, and more broadly, we will continue to hold fast to the supreme goal that has guided us and guided me for most of my adult life, that Iran will not have a nuclear weapon, and to those who still have doubts about Israel's resolve, it will not happen. Iran has never had a nuclear weapon. Iran has never indicated that they intend to build nuclear weapons. It's just...
This woman in Kansas City searched her name and found $6.1 million in unclaimed money. Like, what?
The fake cover story that keeps getting repeated, even though it is abundantly clear what Israel is actually up to. But, Cenk, this is going to be the final face-off, if you ask me.
Yeah, it is. This is going to determine everything, what happens in Lebanon. So number one, he's super clear, we're not leaving. And he's said that now half a dozen times. All the cabinet ministers have said it. So that's not in doubt at all. The only people who are pretending that Israel's still doing self-defense in Lebanon is American media. So like, by the way, if you don't live in America, you know that they invaded Lebanon and they're trying to take that as part of their territory. If you live in America, you don't know that because you heard that they're responding to Hezbollah's attacks against them. No, they've said, and the people who know it the best are actually live in Israel, because the Israeli press reports all the time their quotes of their politicians saying, yeah, we intend to take southern Lebanon. So when he says we're going to give northern Israel the tranquility we gave Gaza, that's saying we're going to obliterate southern Lebanon and take it so that northern Israel is tranquil because we've now swallowed up southern Lebanon.
Yeah.
And anyway, it's not like he was unclear. He then said, we're not leaving, literally, quote, right? And so when he talked about achievements, though, in Hebrew, I thought that was really interesting because he didn't refer to all the land they've taken as a temporary buffer zone that was necessary for security reasons and self-defense. No, he framed it as achievements. We have taken Gaza. We have taken southern Lebanon. Those are our achievements. We have won them in war. See, at home in Israel, they're barely pretending it has anything to do with self-defense. They're bragging about, we killed them and we took their land because we're stronger than them, which, by the way, isn't true. America is stronger than them, and they've basically robbed and raped America in order to take our military, take trillions of dollars off of us in the wars that we've committed to them. And they brag about, ha, 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 America's in our back pocket. And that's what it, implicitly, between the lines in those statements, that's what Netanyahu's doing again. Saying, yeah, Trump says that we have to leave Lebanon. And I'm not going to leave Lebanon. That means I'm stronger than Trump. Look, I don't know what your plans are for the summer, but if you're still paying Verizon or AT&T tons of money for your phone plan, you should stop. Really, stop right now. My friend Andrew Yang, the guy behind Universal Basic Income, launched a phone company, and he's basically giving money away. He loves to do that. Seriously, it's been a total game changer for me. I use it. Here's the deal. If you sign up right now, new customers get the first 3 months completely free. No tricks, no catch. The whole summer, totally free. That's money you can spend doing things you actually enjoy, like going to the beach, going to a concert, grabbing ice cream with your friends, whatever you want. Not convinced? Here's the cherry on top. Noble Mobile actually pays you to use your phone less. The less data you spend a minute.
They told me neuropathy was permanent. 6 days after using this foot therapy boot, I was walking my dog pain-free.
America to our will. And so when we stay in Lebanon, he knows, now this is my analysis, stronger than America, and we're going to bend America to our will. And so when we stay in Lebanon, he knows, now this is my analysis, that it'll get worse. And when it gets worse, that's when they already have their crying game strategy ready, right? And they're going to come to America and they're going to cry all over television, and all their
Go ahead and
politicians are
shut
going to
it
cry,
down
and they're going to say America owes us.
if that's
And all of
your
American media
choice,
is going to
but
say in
I
unison
hit
that
the
we owe
thumbs
them.
up before reading your
And our
words.
politicians are going to say that. Then is that going to
I'm
work? Are
gonna
they going
end
to
it
be able to
after
drag us
this.
back into the war?
I've been
Now,
on here
if they do,
over 3 hours.
then, MAGA gets the end of crying game. And
Well,
surprise!
thank you for hitting the like
Still working
button.
for Israel. And here's what you got to do next, okay? So if it doesn't work, well, then that's a whole new world where Israel is in a war without us against a pretty powerful country in Iran. Could Israel be in a little bit of trouble?
They're in a lot of trouble, Cenk. I mean, look, at the end of the day, you have to acknowledge that President Trump had no other choice. Even if he wanted to stay in the war against Iran, we were running out of interceptors, much like Israel is running out of interceptors. But Netanyahu and the current Israeli government is unhinged, irrational. And it is terrifying that an irrational actor on the international stage is in possession of nukes. But that is the case. So that's why I keep going back to the nuclear option. Because they know it's not like they don't know they're running out of interceptors. It's not like they don't know the math in this entire scenario. Even the United States doesn't have enough missile interceptors to keep this war going and protect Israel as it keeps going. But Israel wants it to move forward. They want to move forward with the war. What happens when you guys run out of missile interceptors? Is that when you're going to rely on the nukes? That's why I'm concerned here, Cenk.
Yeah. So there's two disaster scenarios. I'm not sure there is a good scenario. So I'm going to get to that in a second. But on TYT.com, we have a poll that I'm curious about your take on it. Will Netanyahu be able to get U.S. politicians and media to side with him over Trump? So initially, of course he will. That's not a question, right? But if Trump draws the line and says, no, we're not continuing the war, will the media and politicians all go to Israel's side and Netanyahu's side and demand that Trump return the war, including Democrats? That's going to be interesting because Democrats are pretending to be against the war, but when the rubber hits the road now and
I don't believe
AIPAC
that.
grabs...
Let me hit this before I go. I don't believe that.
More than before. However, beginning a conflict.
Axios' Mark Caputo just sitting down with the president in Trump's first interview since he signed that agreement with Iran about 24 hours ago. Here's some of what he said.
What have you learned about not just the exercise of power, but the limits on your power as a result of the conflict?
There are no limits.
No.
No, not. I haven't learned that lesson yet. I know there are, but you know, there are no limits. We defeated them totally militarily. I did a naval blockade where not one ship was able to get through. Some
I'm
tried.
gonna go to sleep. I can't deal with it. He coming back out lying.
Iran to the table more than before. However, beginning a conflict, you had talked about you only wanted unconditional surrender. And, well, the MOU doesn't look like unconditional surrender.
Well, it really probably is unconditional surrender.
Yes?
I think so.
He sounds like he's sick.
The incredulity in Mark's voice. We've got much more of this. I mean, Mark went on to question the president about his claims that there's been regime change in Iran. And Trump responded to him in that case. He said, I actually think it's regime change, if you want to know the truth.
He said, what?
Now, Caputo responds to Trump, how is it regime change if you had, and then Trump jumps in on him and says, because they're different people. Caputo responds, but you have Khamenei Jr. You have still a lot of IRGC officials there. To which Trump responds, well, they're different people. All right, Khamenei Jr. is different from the father. It's almost like it's a late night skit. Okay, there's a lot more news from this headline-making interview, and we're going to be talking to Mark Caputo in just a moment. We've got more for you. But you've heard the president make a number of claims in the interview. For example, this whole issue of regime change. Iran's new regime, when he said they're different people, one was the father, now it's the son. Khamenei is a different person than his father, who was killed in the U.S. airstrike, which began the war. That may be about where the differences lend. Just listen to what Kareem Sadjapur, our global affairs analyst, told me. So, Kareem, is this a new regime that's much more reasonable and less radicalized than the two prior regimes over the past 4 months, or 4 weeks, I'm sorry?
That's false, Aaron. It's the same regime. It's new personnel. It's the same ideology. It's a 56-year-old Ayatollah Khamenei instead of an 86-year-old Ayatollah Khamenei. And their fundamental worldview hasn't shifted one iota. So I don't think there's any indication that it's a new group of men with a different ideology.
That sort of just makes the whole point. And as for Trump's claim that the U.S. totally defeated Iran militarily, he has said this, frankly, many times, even during the war itself. But as we have said, when you look at the facts, the reality is that that is not true. Iran's nuclear material, of course, is still there. And we know from Seth Jones and the Center for Strategic and International Studies that Iran still has about 70% of its pre-war missile stockpile and 70% of its launchers. Out front now, Mark Caputo, the White House reporter for Axios, who sat down exclusively with President Trump and shared that clip first with Out Front. I mean, Mark, it's really an extraordinary conversation that you just had. I just want to emphasize, this is the first time Trump has spoken since signing the agreement with Iran, right? The memorandum of understanding.
To his defeat.
He certainly comes off as defiant and defensive in the conversation with you.
He's proud. He thinks the deal, or he's projecting that the deal that he has agreed to, or the memo that he signed, is great because of the stock market and oil prices. That's what he's really fixated on.
So let me play again a little bit more here of where you were pressing him, Mark, on the agreement with Iran that he just signed. Here it is.
What have you learned about not just the exercise of power, but the limits on your power as a result of the conflict.
There are no limits.
No.
No, not. I haven't learned that lesson yet. I know there are, but there are no limits. We defeated them totally militarily.
Beginning a conflict,
Why did
you
you
had
have to
talked
sign
about
this
you only
surrender?
wanted unconditional surrender. And
Well,
the MOU doesn't look like unconditional surrender.
well, it really probably is unconditional surrender.
It is?
I think so.
It's it is, which is the incredulity in your voice, Mark. I mean, we just a moment ago laid out the fact that, saying that they have no military is just not true. And as you point out, maybe with your incredulity, $300 billion of a reconstruction fund, unfreezing of assets of $100 billion, the U.S. agreeing that it's going to withdraw or somehow do something that's unclear to its forces in proximity to Iran and the region. Those things are not unconditional
They gonna
surrender.
do whatever
I guess the question
Iran
for you
tells
is, you're
them to
sitting
do.
there face to face with him. Do you think that he really believes what he's saying to you?
That's one of those enduring questions about Trump, is that when he says what he says he believes, does he really believe it? The reality is he stayed relentlessly on message with this. His view is that their military has been crushed, and let's give him that, is that by and large it's true. The Navy has been seriously damaged, their missile capacity and the like. Yes, there are some reports indicating it's not as destroyed as Trump says it is, but Iran really took a whipping from the United States. However, the reality is, as a lot of experts predicted at the time, the Iranians are tough and they're resilient, and they had war games for this, and they were able to take the whipping and still survive, and were in no mood and were unlikely to unconditionally surrender. And those folks were right. The Iranians have not surrendered unconditionally.
And what about the whole thing on regime change when he was looking you straight in the face and saying it's regime change because it's a different person?
Yeah, that's why I said, well, are you sure about that? You have Khamenei Jr., you have IRGC officials. He said, well, they're different people. Well, okay, but the reality is that the Iranian military and the IRGC structure, the government structure, had anticipated one day the United States and Israel or its enemies would launch a decapitation strike, and as a result they came up with something called the Mosaic Doctrine, which essentially said that there'd be a mosaic, a different patchwork of different leaders who could step in when other leaders were killed, and that's what happened.
Yeah, it's just, I find it interesting, as you say, that the question is, does he really believe what he's saying? But your takeaway from talking to him was that he was remarkably that he stayed consistent with what he was saying to you.
He only had 2 hours of sleep. He flew in from...
He does sound like he's got a cold, or so he did sound a little...
But he was, in the interview, he did have a lower energy level than he normally does, but his overall presentation was pretty positive, and he just loves the idea that gas prices are coming down, oil prices are coming down, and the stock market is going up. That's what he's really fixated on. And that's sort of the sub-headline of this entire thing, is that Trump had had enough of this war. He had had enough of people talking about high fuel prices, and he wanted it to end. And this is the way he brought about an end.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and it does raise so many questions given what he said to you about, is this what really people around him are telling him? Is this the bubble that he's in or not? You also asked him about Netanyahu, and obviously that was at the core, their relationship was at the core of this war to begin with, and now it's the fraying of that relationship is core to how this war is ending, or at least how this agreement has proceeded. What did he say about Netanyahu?
He said, I asked him about the relationship with Netanyahu. He said, Bibi's fine, the relationship's fine. He said, but we need to keep him sane. He used that word sane. The implication is that Netanyahu had gone a little nuts. And I asked him, how are you going to keep Israel from attacking Lebanon? And the subtext of that was, and sort of messing up this deal with Iran, something that Trump had lost his temper with Netanyahu over a few days or a few weeks ago. I've lost track of time. And Trump just said, they'll do what I say. That Israel loves me, and what I tell them to do, they will do. So we're going to see if that sticks.
This might be the only delivery service that actually feels chef-made, because it is. This is Cook Unity, and if you're someone that enjoys delicious food without having to worry about...
Okay, y'all, I'm finna go to sleep. I done all down. Yeah, I'm finna go to sleep. I just all myself down, but I need to wait until I get till my eyes start drifting. Hold on, there was something else I had. I'm finna get in the bed. I just all my body down. And I want to be able to fall asleep. I don't want to be awake. I think it was that guy. Did we hear his deal? Yeah, we heard him.
Stop. Before you scroll past this, I need you to understand something that happened in the last 48 hours that almost nobody is talking about correctly. On June 17th, 2026, June 17th, 2026, Trump is standing in the Palace of Versailles in France, and he is signing a piece of paper, okay? And the moment that paper gets signed, the stock market explodes upward, oil prices crash down, and every major news channel in the world is running the same headline: peace deal, Iran, done. CNN says this is a triumph of diplomacy. Fox News says this is a betrayal. Tehran says this is a victory for Iran. And you know what? None of them are completely wrong. But all of them are asking the wrong question, okay? Because here is what nobody is asking. In the exact same 24 hours, in the exact same window of time, while Washington and Tehran were busy signing that piece of paper, while the cameras were pointed at Versailles, while analysts were arguing about whether Trump won or lost, there was one country, thousands of
I played that one.
The real game in geopolitics is not always in the headlines. It happens through closed-door deals, silent alliances, military positioning, trade pressure, and economic traps. In my PDF book, I break down the hidden angles most channels never explain in detail. The book is updated every Monday with fresh geopolitical insights. Link is in the description. China has spent roughly 15 years building something the Pentagon has no good answer to. Not a missile, not a fighter jet, not a drone swarm. Something quieter and, in the long run, far more dangerous. A way to make the dollar optional. Notice what China did not build. It did not match America in the sky, ship for ship, or base for base. It has not invented a replacement reserve currency that every country on earth is rushing to hold. By every standard measure of dollar power, the dollar is still dominant today. And yet, quietly, systematically, China has been laying pipe.
This is LuxPack, snow crab leg meat by Prime Fish, the next generation of seafood luxury. It's like nothing you've ever experienced before. A revolutionary approach to premium seafood, LuxPack transforms how you enjoy snow crab. Our precision-engineered, single-layer packaging sets a new benchmark in convenience and quality. Each piece of crab leg meat is individually
under the global financial system. A new payment network here, a digital currency settlement there, swap agreements with central banks across 4 continents, a slowly expanding web that for the first time in 50 years gives a large and growing portion of the world a real way to trade and to save and to buy oil without asking the United States for permission. Here is the question that sits at the heart of all of this. America's single greatest advantage is not its aircraft carriers or its nuclear arsenal. It is a superpower that almost no one ever talks about, and that America has used so often it has quietly begun to undermine itself. The power to cut any country on earth off from the global financial system simply by deciding to. China just built the escape hatch. This is not a story about the dollar collapsing next Tuesday. It will not. But it is a story about a wall that America has leaned on for 50 years, that is slowly developing a door it did not build and cannot lock. And once enough of the world finds that door, the wall is not the same wall anymore. And this reaches into your life directly. The dollar's special status is what lets America carry an enormous national debt without the interest payments devouring the budget. It is what keeps your borrowing costs lower than they would otherwise be. Weaken it far enough and you feel it in your mortgage, your groceries, and the cost of everything your government does on your behalf. So let's start with what we actually know. To understand what China built and why, you first have to understand what America has. The dollar's dominance is the single most powerful structural advantage any country has ever held in the modern world. And it rests on a system assembled piece by piece over the last 50 years. Here's how it works. Almost all of the world's oil is bought and sold in dollars. Because energy is the thing every economy needs, every country on earth has to hold dollars to buy it. Those dollars flow into the global financial system, where they end up parked in American government bonds, which means the world is, in effect, constantly lending America the money to run itself at rates lower than almost any other borrower on earth could get. It is a self-reinforcing loop, oil and dollars. Dollars back to America. America borrows cheap, spends freely, and runs the world's reserve currency. The whole system rests on one quiet agreement, reached in 1974 when the United States and Saudi Arabia shook hands and made oil a dollar business. And then there is the second power that comes with running the global financial plumbing. SWIFT is the messaging network that almost every bank on earth uses to move money across borders. America does not own SWIFT outright, but the dollar flows through it, and America's reach into it is so complete that it can effectively decide who gets access to the global financial system and who gets shut out. It has done this to Iran repeatedly. It did it to Russia after 2022, freezing $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves held in Western systems. The message to every government watching was unmistakable. Keep your money inside America's system, and America decides whether you keep it. Now, here is the history that drove China to build what it built. China watched what happened to Russia. It watched what happened to Iran. It watched America sanction, freeze, and cut off governments, companies, and individuals with a swiftness that stunned even America's own allies. And China did the arithmetic about its own future. If a serious conflict ever came over Taiwan, America would reach for that same financial weapon. It would try to do to China what it did to Russia, only bigger. And China decided sometime around a decade ago that it would not still be plugged into that same system when the day came. So China began to build the alternative. Not all at once, not loudly, piece by piece. In the patient way it builds most things, it created CIPS, its own cross-border payment system, as a parallel to SWIFT. It developed the digital yuan, a programmable currency that can settle international transactions without touching a dollar-denominated bank anywhere. It built mBridge, a multi-country platform running on central bank digital currencies that cuts settlement time from the 3 to 5 days SWIFT takes down to about 7 seconds. And it signed currency swap agreements with more than 40 central banks from Africa to Southeast Asia to the Middle East, quietly stitching together a network where countries can trade with each other and settle in something other than dollars. The numbers that have come out of this are hard to dismiss. By 2025, China's CIPS system was processing the equivalent of about $25 trillion in annual transactions, up 43% from the year before.
Who's your interior designer? Darling, it's me.
Wallpaper by Wollaston. Find your style
Y'all
on
please hit the
wollaston.com.
like button.
If you have SNAP or Medicaid, you may qualify for a free iPhone or
421
Samsung,
people
plus
in
up
here.
to 10
Hit
gigabytes
the
of
like
data.
button.
Apply on...
mBridge processed over $55 billion in cross-border payments. 65% of Saudi oil sales to China are now settled in yuan. In 2024, Saudi Arabia did not formally renew the 50-year-old agreement to price oil exclusively in dollars. And the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has fallen from 72% in 2001 to roughly 57% today, a quarter-century low. None of this happened by accident. China studied the architecture of American financial power the way an engineer studies a bridge, looking for the load-bearing points and quietly for the place where a small adjustment changes everything. To see the whole picture clearly, picture two countries sharing a town. America is the lock keeper. It runs the only canal that connects the whole town to the outside world. Every boat that carries food in and every barrel of oil that goes out passes through America's lock. The lock keeper does not charge much, but it controls who gets through and who does not. And everyone in town has quietly accepted that the lock keeper's word is final. China is the tunneler. It cannot fight the lock keeper for the canal. It does not try. Instead, decade by patient decade, it has been digging an alternative route, not a canal, a tunnel under the town, under the walls, under the lock keeper's feet. It does not need the tunnel to carry everything. It only needs the tunnel to exist so that the lock keeper's threat to close the lock is no longer the final word it used to be. Now watch the layers tighten one at a time. The first layer is the most important, and the one the lock keeper noticed too late. America built its financial weapon gradually over decades, and for most of that time, it used it sparingly. But in 2022, when it froze $300 billion in Russian reserves, it crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. It showed every government on earth exactly what the worst case looks like. Your money held inside the global system can be taken from you without warning, without a court, and without appeal. That single act did more to build China's tunnel than anything Beijing could have done on its own. Central banks from Brasilia to Beijing to Riyadh did not immediately abandon the dollar, but they began buying gold in record quantities and testing alternative rails as quiet insurance. America pulled its most powerful financial weapon out of its holster, and the world started building armor. The lock keeper demonstrated the lock was absolute, and the tunnelers went back to work. The second layer is how China turned a weakness into an asset. The yuan has a serious problem. China controls how much of it flows in and out of its own economy, and investors do not fully trust a currency whose government decides its value. That is a genuine barrier. A reserve currency needs to be freely available and freely trusted. The yuan is not that yet, but China's system is not trying to replace the dollar as a reserve currency. It is trying to do something far more targeted. It is trying to route around the specific weapon America wields, the ability to cut a country off from the plumbing. CIPS and M-Bridge do not need the yuan to become the world's savings currency. They only need to carry enough trade that a sanctioned country can still buy oil, pay its suppliers, and move money without passing through America's lock. The tunnel does not have to be as big as the canal. It only has to be big enough. The third layer is the geography of who is already using the tunnel, because the list is not random. Russia, which America has spent years trying to strangle economically, now settles most of its trade in yuan and has moved the bulk of its reserves out of dollar assets entirely. Iran, which has been under American sanctions for decades, uses the alternative rails whenever it can. Saudi Arabia, which was America's closest energy partner for 50 years, signed up to M-Bridge and began accepting yuan for oil shipments to China. India, the world's most populous country, settled significant quantities of oil in currencies other than the dollar. Each one of these is a data point. Stitched together, they are an outline of a world in which the dollar is still the default, but no longer the only option. And the countries choosing the alternative tend to be the ones sitting on the resources that make the world run. That is not a coincidence. It is a structural shift in who holds the leverage. The fourth layer is where America's own behavior has quietly helped build the tunnel it feared. Every time America has reached for the financial weapon, it has given another government a reason to prepare for the day it is used against them. Russia's freeze was the loudest example, but it was not the only one. Sanctions on Iran, sanctions on Venezuela, sanctions on dozens of Chinese companies and officials. Each one was, in the narrow moment, effective. And each one added another hand to the shovel in the tunnel. There is a painful irony buried here. The United States built the most powerful financial weapon in history and then used it so often and so broadly that it taught the world in detail exactly what it needed to build to escape it. Every sanction was a lesson, and China was the most attentive student in the class. The fifth layer is where this becomes a question about the future of American power itself. The dollar's reserve status is not just useful. It is, in a quiet way, the foundation that everything else rests on. It lets America borrow at $36 trillion of debt and still find buyers for its bonds at reasonable rates. It lets America run trade deficits year after year without a currency crisis. It lets America fund a military that costs more than the next 10 countries combined, in part because the whole world is effectively subsidizing it by holding dollars. Begin to erode that foundation, not collapse it, just erode it, and the cost of everything America does goes up. Borrowing costs rise. The military's purchasing power shrinks. The sanctions that were so freely used lose their edge when the target has a working alternative. And the confidence that made the dollar untouchable, the belief that there simply is no other option, starts to look like something that can no longer be taken entirely for granted. The sixth layer is where this becomes a lesson for every country watching, because China is not alone in drawing it. The message China is building in pipes and code and swap agreements is aimed at every government that has ever worried about what America could do to it. And it says something simple and profound. You no longer have to choose between America's system and no system at all. There is a third option, still small, still limited, but growing. And the fact that the option exists changes the negotiation, even for countries that never use it. So what can America do about it? Let's walk through the options, because each one sounds reasonable until it meets the problem, and they all share the same flaw. Option 1, sanction more aggressively. Use financial exclusion on a larger scale to demonstrate that the cost of seeking alternatives is too high. This sounds logical until you remember that the overuse of sanctions is exactly the thing that built the tunnel. Every new sanction is another brick in the wall of the alternative. Doubling down on the tool that created the incentive does not remove the incentive. It feeds it. Option 2, outcompete the alternative. Make the dollar-based system so efficient, so cheap, so trustworthy that no one has a practical reason to leave. This is the most constructive option on the list. And to its credit, America has begun to move toward digital payment modernization and faster cross-border rails. But CIPS grew 43% in a single year. The existing system is not standing still, and the alternative has a head start in the markets it needs most. Option 3, pressure allies to block the alternative. Push friendly governments to refuse access to mBridge and CIPS. This sounds logical until you look at the list of who is already on those systems. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Hong Kong, and a growing list of Southeast Asian nations, most of whom also want to keep trading with both sides. Asking your partners to cut themselves off from a working system is asking them to take a real economic loss on your behalf. Most will not. Option 4, use military strength to enforce the financial order. Demonstrate that America's strategic dominance means the alternative cannot be trusted. But financial plumbing does not care about aircraft carriers. A settlement system in Shanghai that moves money in 7 seconds does not become less functional because a warship is parked in the South China Sea. The financial and the military operate on separate rails, and China has been careful to build the financial one in places where military pressure is not a clean answer, which leaves option 5, the honest one. Accept that the dollar's uncontested dominance cannot be preserved by force or by decree, and that the only lasting answer is to make it genuinely worth choosing by running sound fiscal policy, restraining the use of sanctions to cases where the stakes justify the long-term cost, and leading on the financial technology that will define the next generation of global trade. The lockkeeper cannot stop the tunnel from existing. It can only decide whether the canal is still the better path. Look back at all 5 and the shared flaw is clear. Every option but the last assumes American financial dominance is something that can be commanded. But dominance at this level is not enforced. It is chosen. And China has spent 15 years building a world where choosing something else is no longer impossible. So let's zoom out all the way out, because this was never only about a payment network or a digital currency. It is about the deepest pillar of American power. The belief America has operated on for most of a century is that its financial system is the only serious one, that the dollar is the water everyone drinks and there is no other well, that the ability to cut a country off from the global financial system is as close to absolute power as a peacetime nation can hold. China has spent 15 years quietly drilling a second well. Here is the revelation in one line. America's most powerful non-military weapon works by making its targets desperate. Once the targets have somewhere else to go, the weapon does not disappear. It just becomes less terrifying. And a weapon that is less terrifying is a diminished power. And the deepest part of this is the irony that is almost too uncomfortable to say aloud.
With David AI, you don't need to use Kling, Runway, or CapCut. You can generate
The dollar's reserve status was never maintained by force. It was maintained by trust, by the belief that the system was neutral enough, open enough, and reliable enough that holding dollars was simply the safest thing to do. Every time America used financial sanctions as a weapon, it chipped at that trust. Not enough to crack it overnight. Enough over decades to give a patient rival the opening it needed to build something else. Now, to be fair, the counter-argument here is powerful, and it deserves a genuinely straight answer. The dollar is still, by an enormous margin, the dominant reserve currency at 57% of global reserves. The yuan is at roughly 2 to 3%. SWIFT still dwarfs CIPS in global volume. No country on earth has abandoned the dollar for the yuan as its primary savings vehicle. The tunnel exists, but the canal is still carrying most of the traffic. Anyone who tells you the dollar is about to collapse is not reading the data. But here is what that honest picture still admits. The dollar's share of global reserves has fallen 15 percentage points over 20 years. The alternative infrastructure processes tens of trillions of dollars annually and is growing at over 40% a year. Saudi Arabia, the cornerstone of the petrodollar for half a century, let the formal commitment lapse. And every analyst who studies this seriously agrees that the trend is not reversing. The dollar is not falling. It is slowly losing the thing that made it invincible, the absence of any alternative at all. And that is the part China quietly built. Every rival of America is watching. They have just seen a patient, decade-long project systematically dismantle one pillar of American power, not through confrontation, but through construction. That lesson does not stay in Beijing. So where do things stand right now? At this moment, the dollar is still the world's reserve currency by a wide margin, and it will remain so for years to come. Anyone saying otherwise is selling something, but the architecture around it has changed in ways that cannot be unchanged. The tunnel is there, it is growing, and more hands are reaching for it every year. So sit with the questions that truly decide what comes next. At what point does the tunnel carry enough traffic that America's financial weapon loses its decisive edge? And what does American foreign policy look like on the day it cannot simply cut someone off? If the United States has to choose between using the dollar as a weapon and preserving the trust that makes the dollar worth holding, which choice does it make, and what does the other choice cost? Saudi Arabia did not renew its commitment to pricing oil in dollars. What happens to the whole system the day the oil market decides the dollar is one option rather than the only option? And for the countries quietly testing the alternative rails right now, not because they prefer China, but because they want a second option. What happens when the second option becomes good enough to use every day? Here's the part to hold on to. China did not attack the dollar. It did not need to. It only needed to build a world where the dollar could be avoided by those who had enough reason to try. That is a diminished power, narrower than what America holds today. It is also a power that, once built, cannot simply be bombed away. America's greatest advantage is not gone, but for the first time in 50 years, it is no longer alone in the room.
All right, good night.